Hello there, and welcome to Just About Earth, a quiet place where curiosity slows its breathing and science takes a gentler pace. Wherever you are right now, whether the lights are dimmed or the day is only just beginning, I'm glad you're here. This space exists for questions that don't rush to be answered, and ideas that don't mind sitting with us for a while. Tonight, I'd like to explore a thought that feels simple at first, almost playful, but grows heavier the longer you hold it. What if we are not the first great human civilization to walk this planet? What if we're not even the second, or the third, or the fourth? What if we are the seventh? And what if the others did not fade gently into history, but were erased so thoroughly that only silence remains where they once stood? Before we ease into that idea, let me ask you something small and grounding. Where are you listening from right now? A bedroom? A couch? A late-night train? A quiet kitchen with a single light left on? And what time is it there? Not the exact minute, just the feeling of the hour. Early enough that the world still hums, or late enough that it feels like everything has stepped back a little. It's always fitting to ask questions about time while talking about civilizations, because time is the one thing they all depend on, and the one thing that eventually leaves them behind. If you find this space calming, or if these slow, careful ideas help your mind loosen its grip on the day, you're always welcome to like the video or subscribe. It helps this small, quiet corner reach others who might need something unhurried to listen to. But for now, there's nowhere else to be. Just settle in, let your thoughts soften, and follow this idea wherever it gently wanders. We're used to thinking of civilization as a ladder. Each rung represents progress, and humanity climbs upward from stone tools to satellites, from campfires to cities that glow at night like constellations fallen to Earth. It's a comforting image. It suggests momentum. It implies that once something is learned, it is never truly lost. But ladders are human inventions. Nature prefers cycles. Seasons return. Mountains rise and erode. Oceans advance and retreat. Even stars are born, burn brightly and collapse into something quieter. So it's worth asking whether civilization truly moves in a straight line, or whether it behaves more like everything else on this planet. Whether it rises, flourishes, falters, and sometimes vanishes entirely. When we look back at recorded history, we see gaps that feel manageable. The fall of Rome, the collapse of the Maya, the disappearance of the Indus Valley cities. These events feel distant, but not unreachable. We can point to ruins, broken stones, half-buried roads. We can trace causes, argue about droughts or invasions or political decay. These civilizations are gone, but they are not erased. They left fingerprints. But recorded history is a very short book. If the entire existence of Earth were compressed into a single calendar year, humans would arrive in the final minutes of the last day. Written language would appear seconds before midnight. Everything we call ancient history would fit into a breath so short it almost doesn't count. That leaves an unsettling amount of blank space before the story we know even begins. For hundreds of thousands of years, anatomically modern humans lived, learned, adapted, and survived without writing anything down. They crossed continents. They mastered fire. They developed social structures, traditions, and knowledge systems that allowed them to endure ice ages, predators, and dramatic shifts in climate. We often call these people primitive, but that word says more about our assumptions than their abilities. Now imagine that somewhere in that vast stretch of unwritten time, knowledge accumulated slowly. Skills layered upon skills, not overnight, not dramatically, but patiently. Imagine generations refining techniques, passing down information orally, improving tools, organizing communities in ways that left little stone behind. Imagine a civilization that valued materials that decay: wood, fiber, clay, bone. Imagine cities that breathed with the landscape instead of dominating it. Then imagine something happening. Not a single catastrophe necessarily, maybe several. A long drought followed by sudden flooding, a shift in ocean currents, a volcanic winter, an ice sheet creeping southward, a combination of events that made survival the only priority, pushing knowledge into the background, then into memory, and finally into nothing at all. The Earth is very good at cleaning up after itself. Given enough time, forests reclaim cities, oceans swallow coastlines, tectonic plates drag entire landscapes back into the mantle. Even our own modern cities, if abandoned, would not last as long as we like to imagine. Steel rusts, concrete cracks, glass shatters and weathers into sand. Plastics persist, but scattered, broken, unrecognisable. After 10,000 years, our skyscrapers would be ghosts. After 100,000, almost nothing would remain that clearly announces who we were. And after 1,000,000, even our most stubborn traces would blur into geology. This is where the idea becomes less speculative and more uncomfortable. Because if civilizations existed long enough ago, and if they fell hard enough, the Earth may have already done what it always does. It may have erased them. We tend to assume that advanced civilizations must leave obvious scars, massive quarries, deep mines, vast layers of pollution. But that assumption is shaped by our own habits. We dig aggressively, we burn recklessly, we spread quickly. Another civilization, shaped by different constraints and values, might not look like us at all. What if they live near coastlines that are now underwater? Sea levels have risen and fallen dramatically over Earth's history. Entire continental shelves that were once dry land are now hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water. Those areas are difficult to study, expensive to explore, and largely ignored compared to land-based archaeology. If a civilization thrived there during a glacial period and was swallowed by rising seas, we might never notice. What if they used metals sparingly, recycled obsessively, or favoured materials that return easily to the Earth? What if their cities were grown, not built, using living structures that decayed naturally after abandonment? What if their greatest achievements were social, biological, or informational, in ways that don't fossilise well? We already know that the archaeological record is incomplete. Entire cultures are known only through fragments, a shard of pottery, a pattern of post holes, a single tool. From that, we build stories, sometimes accurate, sometimes wildly wrong. The further back we go, the quieter the record becomes. Now consider how fragile knowledge really is. Writing feels permanent, but it depends on continuity. Libraries burn, languages die, symbols lose meaning. If a civilization collapses fast enough, or thoroughly enough, its accumulated understanding can vanish within a few generations. Oral traditions are powerful, but they require stability. Disruption breaks the chain. There is also the uncomfortable fact that we may not recognise the evidence even if we find it. We look for ourselves in the past, stone cities, straight roads, sharp angles, clear boundaries. If something doesn't fit our expectations, we may label it natural and move on. A formation that looks too old, too eroded, too strange is often dismissed because it doesn't align with the story we already believe. Belief plays a larger role in science than we like to admit. Not belief in the mystical sense, but in the structural sense. Paradigms shape what questions are allowed. If the prevailing assumption is that civilization is recent, then anything suggesting otherwise must meet an impossibly high standard of proof. The burden is heavy. The skepticism is fierce, sometimes rightly so, sometimes not. This doesn't mean that every strange artifact or out-of-place structure points to a lost global civilization. Most don't. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and we are very good at seeing intention where there is none. But the existence of false ideas doesn't erase the possibility of true ones. It simply means we must tread carefully. The idea of multiple human civilizations rising and falling before us challenges something deeper than archaeology. It challenges our sense of uniqueness. We like to believe we are special, the first to build, the first to think, the first to understand the universe well enough to ask these questions. Being the seventh implies humility. It suggests repetition. It implies that intelligence does not guarantee permanence. It also reframes our relationship with the future. If others came before us and vanished, then progress is not a promise. It is a phase, one that must be maintained deliberately, or it will dissolve like everything else. There is a strange comfort in that too. It means failure is not uniquely ours. It means the universe is not waiting for us to get it right on the first try. It also means that the Earth is patient beyond our comprehension. It can host intelligence, lose it, and carry on without sentiment. When we look at our own civilization, we see how fragile it already is. Global systems depend on constant coordination. Power grids, supply chains, digital infrastructure, food distribution. A disruption in one place ripples outward. Resilience exists, but it is uneven. Knowledge is vast but specialized. Many people understand small parts. Few understand the whole. If something were to fracture that system deeply enough, much of what we consider permanent would disappear quickly. Not because it was weak, but because complexity requires continuity. Break the chain, and even great structures fall silent. Thinking this way doesn't require believing that ancient high-tech civilizations existed. It only requires acknowledging that civilization itself is a fragile arrangement, not a guaranteed trajectory. Whether the previous cycles were advanced in ways we would recognize or advanced in ways entirely unlike us remains an open question. The unsettling part is not the specifics, it's the pattern: rise, flourish, forget, erase. As this idea settles, there's no need to rush toward conclusions. Questions like this are better held than answered. They stretch the mind gently, loosening rigid timelines, making room for deeper time. They remind us that we're standing on a planet with a long memory and a very effective eraser. And as we continue, we'll start looking more closely at where the gaps actually are. Not the dramatic ones filled with speculation, but the quiet ones. The places where time grows thin, the moments where something should be there, but isn't. Those silences are often more interesting than any artifact. For now, just let the thought rest with you, that beneath your feet may lie not just soil and stone, but stories that were never written, lessons that were never learned twice, and civilizations that lived their entire existence long before we ever thought to count the years. There is a certain comfort in believing that history has a clear beginning and a well-defined middle, and that we're now standing somewhere near the most advanced edge of it. That comfort comes from structure. It gives the past a shape we can understand and the future a direction we think we recognize. But when you slow down and really sit with the idea of history, not as a textbook timeline but as a physical process unfolding on a restless planet, that comfort begins to soften. History, after all, is not the same thing as the past. History is what survives. It is what remains legible after time, pressure, erosion, fire, water, and forgetfulness have done their work. The past itself is far larger, messier, and mostly unreachable. We only ever see fragments of it, and from those fragments we build stories that feel complete because we want them to be. The quiet idea that history may not be finished begins with noticing how thin our confidence really is. We talk about ancient times as though they are fully mapped, but most of what we claim to know is inferred from what little remains. A tool here, a burial there, a layer of ash, a shift in pollen trapped in sediment. These clues are precious, but they are also incomplete. They are whispers, not recordings. Imagine trying to reconstruct your entire life based on a handful of objects found thousands of years from now. A spoon, a cracked phone screen, a pair of shoes, a faded photograph with no caption. From those items, someone might guess your diet, your technology, maybe your social structure. But they would miss almost everything that mattered. Your thoughts, your fears, your relationships. The systems you relied on daily without thinking. The knowledge you carried but never wrote down. The things that felt permanent to you but left no durable trace. Now expand that thought to entire cultures. We often assume that if something important happened, it would leave behind evidence sturdy enough to reach us. But importance does not guarantee durability. In fact, many of the things that matter most to a civilization are the least likely to survive. Language spoken rather than written. Knowledge passed through apprenticeship instead of books. Values embedded in behaviour rather than monuments. Even technology, if built from organic or recycled materials, can vanish astonishingly fast. This is where the idea that history may not be finished quietly takes root, not as a dramatic claim that everything we know is wrong, but as a gentle acknowledgement that what we know is partial, provisional, always subject to revision when new evidence appears or when old evidence is seen differently. There was a time when humans were thought to have arrived in the Americas only a few thousand years ago. Then sites appeared that pushed that date back, and back again. Each discovery didn't just add a few years, it reshaped migration models, survival strategies, and assumptions about capability. The same pattern has repeated itself across the world. Timelines stretch, dates shift. What once seemed settled becomes tentative. These revisions rarely make headlines in the way speculative theories do, but they quietly change the foundation beneath our feet. They remind us that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially when dealing with deep time. History is also shaped by where we look. Archaeology favours places that are accessible, dry, and politically stable enough to study. That alone filters the past. Vast regions of the Earth are underexplored, not because nothing happened there, but because reaching them is difficult. Dense jungles, deserts, ocean floors, polar regions. Even now, with satellites and advanced tools, we struggle to see beneath forest canopies or thick sediment without disturbing what lies below. If previous civilizations existed in regions that later became inhospitable, submerged, or geologically unstable, they would be underrepresented or completely missing from our current understanding. And because history tends to reinforce itself, missing regions stay missing. We build narratives around what we have, not around what might be absent. Another layer of quiet uncertainty comes from how we define civilization in the first place. The word itself carries assumptions: cities, agriculture, hierarchies, monumental architecture, writing. These markers are useful, but they are also narrow. They describe a particular style of social organisation, one that happens to align closely with how our own civilization developed. But human intelligence is flexible. Social complexity does not have a single blueprint. A civilization does not have to look like ours to function, to advance, or to endure for long periods. It only has to solve problems effectively within its environment. Food, shelter, cooperation, knowledge transfer, conflict management. Everything else is optional. If a society achieved stability without dense cities, without large stone buildings, or without centralized power, it might leave behind very little that fits our criteria. Its success would not announce itself in ruins. It would be written into landscapes that later changed, into practices that ended when conditions shifted. There is also the matter of time compression. The further back we go, the more time collapses in our perception. 10,000 years becomes a blur. 50,000 feels abstract. 100,000 is almost meaningless in everyday thought. Yet for the Earth, these are brief intervals. Entire ice ages come and go. Coastlines redraw themselves. Species adapt or disappear. A civilization that lasted several thousand years, long enough to feel ancient and stable to those within it, could still vanish completely within a geological blink, especially if it ended before developing materials that resist decay on million-year timescales. Even our own civilization, with all its concrete and steel, may not fare as well as we imagine. We like to think of ourselves as leaving an unmistakable layer in the geological record. A bright line future scientists will easily recognize, but erosion does not respect intention. Chemical weathering, tectonic movement, and biological activity are relentless. Over enough time, they grind clarity into ambiguity. Plastic may persist, but scattered fragments are not stories. Radioactive signatures decay. Buildings crumble. Data stored digitally vanishes without constant maintenance. What remains might look less like a clear chapter in history and more like a puzzling anomaly, easy to misinterpret or overlook entirely. The idea that history may not be finished is also tied to humility about interpretation. Archaeology is not just discovery, it is interpretation layered upon interpretation. Artifacts do not speak. People speak for them, and people bring biases, expectations, and cultural frameworks into that process. There have been countless examples where early interpretations were later overturned. Structures assumed to be ceremonial turn out to be practical. Objects thought decorative are revealed to be tools. Assumptions about social hierarchy dissolve under closer examination. These shifts are not failures. They are part of learning, but they also show how tentative our reconstructions are. Now imagine extending that tentativeness much further back, beyond the comfort zone of written records, beyond the era where we expect to find familiar patterns. The uncertainty grows, the confidence thins, the possibility space widens. It's here that the notion of unfinished history becomes less about proving lost civilizations and more about recognizing the limits of closure. History feels finished because we package it neatly. We assign periods, we draw lines, we teach it as a sequence of solved problems. But the actual past is not obligated to fit our categories. There is also a psychological reason we resist the idea of unfinished history. It destabilizes identity. If we're not clearly at the forefront of a linear progression, then our role changes. We're no longer the culmination. We become participants in a longer, more uncertain process. That can feel unsettling, especially in a culture that values novelty and advancement. Yet there is something quietly reassuring about it as well. It suggests that intelligence and culture are not rare flukes but recurring possibilities. It means that failure is not final, and that beginnings are not singular. It reframes humanity not as a brief miracle, but as part of a pattern the Earth seems capable of supporting again and again. This perspective also changes how we think about the future. If history is not finished, then neither is the story of civilization. What we are building now is not guaranteed permanence. It is a phase that requires care, adaptation, and awareness. Others may have reached similar points before, confident in their continuity, unaware of how quickly circumstances can change. When you look at the present through that lens, small things feel heavier. Environmental shifts, resource strain, social fragmentation. These are not just modern problems. They are recurring pressures that any complex society must navigate. History does not repeat in detail, but it often echoes in structure. The quietness of this idea matters. It does not shout. It does not demand belief. It simply invites consideration. It asks you to hold open a space in your thinking where certainty softens into curiosity, where the timeline becomes less rigid, where the past is allowed to be larger than the version we currently see, and there is no rush to resolve that space. Unfinished ideas are not weaknesses. They are signs of honest inquiry. They acknowledge that knowledge grows by revisiting assumptions, not by defending them at all costs. As you sit with this thought, you may notice how often history feels settled simply because we stop asking questions. Once something is labelled ancient, it becomes inert in our minds. But ancient does not mean simple. It does not mean static. It only means distant. Distance, especially across time, has a way of smoothing complexity into caricature. Whole cultures become footnotes. Entire epochs compress into a paragraph. What is lost is not just detail, but possibility. And possibility is what keeps history alive. Because if history were truly finished, if every major chapter had been written and neatly closed, there would be nothing left to discover except minor corrections. But that is not the world we live in. New findings continue to surface. Old assumptions continue to bend. The story continues to rearrange itself as our tools improve and our questions deepen. The idea that we might not be the first, or that others might have come before and disappeared, fits naturally into this unfinished quality. It does not require extraordinary claims. It only requires accepting that the past may be more layered than our current outline suggests. Long before memory learned how to write itself down, long before stories hardened into dates and names, humans were already living complex lives on this planet. They woke, worked, learned, taught, adapted, and wondered, just as we do now. The difference is not that they lacked depth or intelligence, but that their depth was carried in ways that do not fossilize easily. When we talk about civilizations before memory began, we are really talking about lives lived before permanence became a goal. Memory, in the way we usually mean it, depends on records, marks that outlast a single lifetime, stone carvings, clay tablets, ink pressed into fibre. Once those appear, the past becomes louder. It starts leaving echoes we can hear across thousands of years. But before that threshold, existence does not go silent. It simply becomes harder for us to listen. For most of human history, knowledge moved through mouths, hands, and shared attention. Skills were taught by watching, rules were reinforced through behaviour, stories were repeated until they shaped identity itself. This kind of memory is resilient in the short term and fragile in the long one. It thrives in continuity but collapses quickly under disruption. When environments shift, when groups scatter, when survival overrides tradition, oral knowledge thins and then disappears. This is why the idea of civilizations before memory began feels slippery, not because nothing happened, but because the way it happened left few durable marks. We're accustomed to thinking that complexity must leave behind architecture, inscriptions and tools that scream intention. But that expectation is shaped by our own material habits. We build things to last because we believe in lasting. Another society, shaped by different pressures, might value adaptability instead. Consider how much knowledge you personally carry that has no physical form. Passwords, routines, unwritten rules of your job, social cues, practical know-how that exist only because you've practiced it. Now imagine that knowledge spread across an entire population, refined over generations, never written down because there was no need. That knowledge would be real, functional and powerful, yet invisible to the future if the chain were broken. The earliest humans we know about were not isolated individuals wandering aimlessly. They formed groups, they coordinated, they shared food. They developed tools and techniques that worked well enough to spread across continents. That alone suggests systems of teaching and organization. You do not cross harsh landscapes or adapt to wildly different climates without collective intelligence. As time went on, those systems would have grown more intricate. Social roles emerge naturally in any group. Someone becomes especially skilled at tool-making, someone else at navigation, healing, conflict resolution. Over time, specialization deepens. Trade begins, even if informally. Resources move. Ideas move faster. None of this requires writing, it only requires memory held in people. Now imagine that process unfolding not over centuries but over tens of thousands of years. With each generation refining what came before, not in a straight line, but in response to local conditions. Some groups would stagnate, others would flourish. Some would innovate quietly, finding solutions that worked so well they became invisible. A society that mastered sustainable living within its environment might leave fewer traces than one that struggled against it. If tools were repaired endlessly instead of discarded, there would be fewer remains. If shelters were temporary by design, meant to move with seasons or resources, they would vanish quickly after abandonment. If landscapes were managed subtly, through controlled burns or selective harvesting, later observers might mistake intentional shaping for natural variation. We already know that humans have been altering ecosystems for far longer than once believed. Evidence of early landscape management exists, but it is often understated. Fire was used deliberately not just for warmth or cooking, but to guide animal movement and plant growth. These practices required planning, coordination, and long-term observation. They also leave almost no trace after enough time has passed. Memory without writing is not weaker, it is simply different. It encodes information in behaviour rather than objects. It relies on repetition rather than storage, and it is deeply tied to stability. Break the rhythm, and the memory fades. This fragility matters when we think about civilizations before memory began, because it suggests that entire ways of living could vanish without leaving behind clear ruins, not because they were small or insignificant, but because their strength lay in continuity rather than accumulation. There is also the matter of catastrophe. Human history has not unfolded under gentle conditions. Climate has swung dramatically. Ice sheets advanced and retreated. Sea levels rose and fell by hundreds of feet. Regions that were once fertile became deserts. Others flooded. These changes were not gradual on human timescales. Some happened within a few generations. A society thriving in a coastal region during a glacial period would find itself displaced or destroyed as the seas rose. Settlements would drown. Evidence would scatter. What remains would be buried under layers of sediment, reshaped by currents or broken apart by erosion. Even today we struggle to study submerged landscapes. What lies beneath ancient shorelines is largely unknown. Then there are volcanic events. Massive eruptions can bury entire regions under ash. They erase settlements, poison land, and alter climate. Survivors scatter. Knowledge fragments. Over time, vegetation returns, animals follow, and the ash becomes just another layer in the Earth's memory. Without written records, all that remains is silence and soil. Disease, too, plays a role. A widespread illness can dismantle social structures faster than any invasion. Elders die. Specialists disappear. Practices that required continuity fail. The group survives, but the system collapses. Over generations, memory thins until only vague traditions remain, stripped of their original context. When we imagine civilizations before memory, we often picture dramatic rises and equally dramatic falls. But the reality may have been quieter, gradual dispersal, slow forgetting, adaptation into something simpler, a loss of complexity without extinction. The people continue, but the civilization dissolves. This is particularly important because genetic continuity does not equal cultural continuity. A population can survive biologically while losing most of what once defined its way of life. Languages change, techniques disappear, stories lose their meaning. From the outside, it looks like a simple culture emerging. From the inside, it feels like loss layered over generations. Modern archaeology tends to privilege moments of accumulation, dense settlements, durable materials, sharp transitions, but cultures that prioritized balance over expansion would be underrepresented. Their success would look like absence. Their disappearance would leave little to mark the change. There is also the uncomfortable possibility that we underestimate early human cognition. We often assume that without writing or advanced tools, thinking must have been limited. But cognitive capacity is not the same as technological expression. The brain that imagined art tens of thousands of years ago is the same brain that designed spacecraft today. What differs is context, opportunity, and accumulated infrastructure. Early humans created symbolic art, complex rituals, and long-distance trade networks far earlier than once believed. These behaviours suggest abstract thinking, planning, and shared meaning. They also suggest that humans were capable of organising their lives in sophisticated ways, without leaving behind cities made of stone. If a civilization arose that prioritised knowledge over monument, relationship over record, and adaptation over expansion, it might never announce itself in the way we expect. It would live, change, and possibly end without carving its name into the planet. The phrase, "before memory began," does not mean before humans remembered. It means before memory became external. before knowledge detached itself from living people and settled into objects that outlived them. That transition is profound. It changes how societies relate to time. It creates the illusion of permanence. Once writing exists, forgetting becomes harder. Ideas can be revived. Systems can be reconstructed. Collapse no longer means total erasure. Before that, collapse is final in a different way, not biologically but informationally. This helps explain why the archaeological record grows richer suddenly and unevenly. Writing does not just preserve information, it amplifies it. Once it appears, everything becomes louder. The silence before it can feel empty by comparison, but it is not. It is simply quieter than our tools are designed to detect. There is also the question of how many times complexity can arise independently. We often talk about civilization as a singular achievement, but complexity is a natural outcome of cooperation over time. Given enough stability, humans organize. They always have. What differs is the form that organization takes. Some forms are visible to us, others may not be. If several cycles of complex human societies existed before writing, each shaped by different environments and challenges, they might leave behind patterns we do not yet recognize as cultural. Subtle soil changes, unusual plant distributions, genetic signals of long-term habitation. These are harder to interpret and easier to dismiss. The idea that civilizations could exist before memory does not require lost super technology or advanced machines. It only requires acknowledging that civilization is not synonymous with stone buildings and written law. It is a pattern of sustained cooperation, knowledge transfer, and environmental interaction. Those patterns can exist without leaving behind the kinds of artifacts we are trained to find. If civilizations existed before memory began, then the Earth may have already hosted and forgotten multiple chapters of human complexity. Not because they were insignificant, but because time favours certain kinds of traces and not others. And once you allow that possibility to settle, even gently, the next question follows without effort. If entire civilizations could rise and fall before memory hardened into history, then what exactly determines what survives for us to find, and what vanishes without a sound? When we imagine lost civilizations, the mind often jumps to hidden ruins just beneath the soil, waiting patiently to be uncovered by the right shovel or satellite image. It is an appealing image. Stone cities swallowed by jungles, roads traced faintly under desert sands, towers buried but intact, as if history simply misplaced them. But the Earth does not misplace things for long. It is not a careful archivist. It is an active system, constantly rearranging its surface, and that is precisely why it keeps so few secrets where we can easily reach them. The surface of this planet is restless. Even when it looks still, it is moving, grinding, dissolving, growing, and breaking down. Wind scours expose stone grain by grain. Rain seeps into cracks, freezes, expands, and pries rock apart. Rivers shift course, cutting new channels while burying old ones under layers of sediment. Plants push roots into every weakness, breaking structures apart quietly and efficiently. Animals burrow, microbes digest. Nothing on the surface stays untouched for long. This matters because we tend to underestimate how quickly clear signs of human activity disappear. A building does not need to be destroyed violently to vanish. It only needs to be abandoned. Without constant repair, roofs fail first. Water enters, materials rot, walls collapse inward. Over decades, rubble spreads. Over centuries, vegetation takes hold. Over millennia, what remains becomes indistinguishable from the surrounding geology unless it is made of very specific materials and preserved under very specific conditions. Even stone, which feels eternal to us, is temporary on geological timescales. Limestone dissolves in slightly acidic rain. Granite fractures under temperature changes. Sandstone erodes easily under wind. What survives longest is not always what was built most impressively, but what happened to be protected from exposure. Burial, ironically, preserves better than openness. This creates a strange bias in what we find. We are more likely to discover things that were quickly covered than things that stood proudly in the open. A settlement buried by a flood or ashfall may be preserved in detail, while one that stood undisturbed for centuries can be erased almost completely. Catastrophe can be a better historian than stability. The Earth also has no obligation to preserve continuity. Landscapes are rewritten repeatedly. Coastlines migrate. Glaciers scrape bedrock clean. Deserts expand and contract. Forests come and go. What looks like a stable environment over a few human lifetimes may be radically transformed over a few thousand years. This is especially important when considering how much of the planet's surface has been recycled. Plate tectonics alone ensures that vast areas of ancient surface have been subducted back into the mantle. Oceanic crust in particular is constantly renewed. Almost none of it is older than a few 100 million years. Anything that existed on those surfaces is gone completely, not hidden, not buried, but destroyed. Even continental crust, which is more stable, is far from permanent. Mountain ranges rise and erode. Sediments accumulate and lithify, then are uplifted and eroded again. What we see today is not the Earth as it was, but the Earth as it happens to be now, shaped by countless overlapping processes. Because of this, the idea that the surface should be littered with obvious evidence of all past civilizations assumes a static planet. It assumes that once something is built, it stays put unless deliberately removed. That assumption does not hold. The default state of the Earth is transformation. Consider how much effort is required to maintain modern infrastructure. Roads crack without maintenance. Bridges corrode. Buildings require constant care. Even with advanced materials and engineering, our structures are temporary arrangements resisting entropy. Remove human attention, and they revert to components remarkably quickly. Now imagine earlier societies without steel reinforcement, without synthetic sealants, without industrial-scale quarrying. Their structures, even if impressive by contemporary standards, would be more vulnerable to weathering. And if they were built from materials that blended with the environment, their remains would dissolve even faster. There is also the question of where people chose to live. Humans are drawn to water. Rivers, lakes, coastlines. These are also the most dynamic environments on Earth. Rivers flood and shift. Deltas migrate. Shorelines drown and re-emerge. Settlements built in these areas are productive and connected, but they are also at risk. Over the last Ice Age cycle alone, sea levels rose more than 100 metres. That change did not happen gently everywhere. Vast coastal plains were submerged. Any settlements there are now underwater, often beneath thick layers of sediment. Exploring these areas is technically challenging, expensive, and still in its early stages. We have mapped only a small fraction of the seafloor in detail. This means that much of the Earth's former habitable land is currently inaccessible, not lost in theory, but unreachable in practice. And because archaeology tends to follow feasibility, these areas remain blank spots in our understanding. The surface also lies to us in subtler ways. Processes like bioturbation, the mixing of soil by organisms, blur layers over time. Roots, insects, worms, and small animals constantly churn the ground. This disrupts stratigraphy, making it harder to read clear sequences of occupation. In humid environments, this happens quickly. In tropical regions especially, organic decay is rapid and relentless. That is one reason why some of the oldest known archaeological sites are found in dry caves or arid regions. Preservation there is the exception, not the rule. We see what survives, not what was most common. This creates an illusion of scarcity. It can feel as though early humans left very little behind because they did very little. But in reality, they may have done quite a lot in places and ways that did not preserve well. The Earth does not treat all activities equally. It favours some traces and it erases others. We also tend to think of secrets as hidden deliberately, as though the past is concealing itself. But the Earth does not hide. It simply moves on. Its processes are indifferent to meaning. A wall is just another arrangement of minerals. A road is just compacted sediment. Over time, those distinctions blur. When we say the Earth keeps few secrets on the surface, what we really mean is that the surface is a poor place to expect long-term preservation. It is exposed to everything: temperature changes, weather, biological activity, human reuse. Later societies often dismantle earlier ones, reusing materials, altering landscapes, building on top of what came before. Cities are rarely abandoned cleanly. They are scavenged. Stones are repurposed. Foundations are dug up. The past is recycled into the present. Over generations, the original form disappears not through destruction but through use. This is not unique to modern humans. It likely happened wherever people lived in proximity over long periods, each group building upon the remnants of the last, unaware or unconcerned with preserving an earlier pattern. Over time, layers compress, distinctions fade. There's also the matter of scale. We imagine civilizations as vast and centralized, but early complex societies may have been more distributed. Networks of smaller communities linked by shared knowledge and trade rather than dominated by monumental centers. Such networks are resilient in life but elusive in death. Remove the connections and the nodes look ordinary. A cluster of villages, each built lightly, leaving little behind, could support a sophisticated culture without ever producing ruins that demand attention thousands of years later. Its complexity would exist in relationships, not structures. Once those relationships dissolve, the material footprint shrinks rapidly. The Earth is particularly good at erasing things that blend in. Sharp contrasts survive longer. A metal object in soil stands out. A stone wall among loose sediment is noticeable. But structures built from local materials, shaped to the land, decay into familiarity. They become part of the background. This raises an uncomfortable possibility. We may already have walked past the remains of earlier civilizations without recognizing them as such. Not because they were hidden cleverly, but because they no longer look like what we expect ruins to look like. They have been weathered into ambiguity. None of this suggests that evidence is impossible to find. It suggests that it is uneven, biased, and often subtle. The Earth does not erase everything equally, but it does erase most things eventually. What survives is shaped as much by chance as by significance. This is why the absence of obvious surface ruins does not automatically rule out deep histories. It only tells us that if such histories existed, they did not align with the narrow conditions required for long-term surface preservation. And that is not surprising. We are still learning how to read the Earth more carefully. New techniques allow us to detect buried features without excavation. Isotopic analysis reveals patterns invisible to the naked eye. Genetic studies hint at movements and interactions long before written records. Slowly, the past becomes a little less silent. But even with these tools, the surface will always be incomplete. It is the most dynamic layer of the planet, constantly rewritten by forces far larger than any one culture. Expecting it to serve as a comprehensive archive misunderstands its nature. When we lay humanity's past out as a timeline, it often looks reassuringly complete. A long line stretches backward, dotted with dates, names and discoveries, giving the impression of continuity. One thing follows another. Tools improve, cultures rise, knowledge accumulates. But that impression depends heavily on how closely you look. From a distance, the line appears smooth. Up close, it is broken by long stretches where the signal fades and the story becomes thin. These stretches are the strange gaps in humanity's timeline. They are not moments of nothingness. Humans were still alive, still thinking, still adapting. But from our present vantage point, those periods appear oddly quiet. The evidence thins, the clarity dissolves, and what remains are questions that feel disproportionate to their subtlety. One of the first things to notice is how unevenly time is represented. certain eras feel crowded with information. We know what people ate, how they governed themselves, what they believed, how they buried their dead. Other eras, often much longer in duration, are summarized in a few cautious sentences. Thousands of years can be reduced to a phrase like, "little is known," as though knowledge simply paused. It did not pause. It just did not survive in forms we can easily recognize. This unevenness creates a misleading sense of acceleration. It can feel as though human development suddenly sped up, as though intelligence or creativity switched on at a specific moment, but that perception is shaped by preservation, not by cognition. The closer we get to the present, the more artifacts survive. Writing appears, durable materials become common, records multiply. The past grows louder, not necessarily more active. Earlier periods, by contrast, are filtered through loss. Organic materials decay, landscapes change, entire regions become inaccessible. What remains is a sparse sample, and from that sample we are tempted to draw broad conclusions. One of the most striking gaps is between the emergence of anatomically modern humans and the sudden appearance of what we label as civilization. For tens of thousands of years, humans existed with brains identical to ours. They created art, practiced rituals, travelled long distances, and adapted to extreme environments. Then, relatively abruptly in the archaeological record, agriculture, permanent settlements, and complex social hierarchies appear. This transition is often framed as a breakthrough, a turning point where humanity crossed a threshold. But thresholds rarely appear so cleanly in reality. More often, they are the result of gradual processes that become visible only when certain conditions align. The gap here is not one of ability but of evidence. We do not see the full build-up because much of it did not fossilize. Early experiments with cultivation may have failed repeatedly before succeeding. Temporary settlements may have been abandoned without leaving durable traces. Social structures may have existed that did not require monumental architecture. What we call a sudden rise may actually be the moment when conditions favoured preservation. Climate stabilised. Certain plants and animals proved suitable for domestication. Population densities increased. Materials like stone and fired clay became more common. The record thickened. Another strange gap appears in technological consistency. Stone tools, for example, persist for extraordinarily long periods with relatively little visible change. For hundreds of thousands of years, similar forms appear across vast regions. This has often been interpreted as stagnation. But that interpretation assumes that innovation must always leave behind new shapes. In reality, stability can indicate effectiveness. A tool that works well does not need to change dramatically. Improvements may be subtle. Techniques may advance while forms remain similar. Knowledge can deepen without altering outward appearance. If a tool is made of stone and discarded in the same way for millennia, it creates the illusion of sameness even if the society using it is changing internally. The gap here is between visible change and invisible progress. We see the former more easily and mistake its absence for lack of development. There are also gaps in migration narratives. We know that humans spread across the globe, reaching nearly every habitable environment, but the routes, timelines, and motivations for these movements are often uncertain. We infer them from genetics, from scattered sites, from environmental clues. In many cases, the story is stitched together from fragments separated by thousands of years. Between those fragments lie long journeys we cannot see clearly, campsites that left no trace, decisions made under pressure, detours taken in response to weather or conflict, entire lifetimes spent moving through landscapes that have since changed beyond recognition. These migration gaps matter because movement spreads knowledge. Techniques, ideas, and practices travel with people. When groups separate and reunite, innovation accelerates. When they remain isolated, traditions diverge. These dynamics shape civilization, but they are difficult to reconstruct without continuous evidence. Another unsettling gap appears in population continuity. There are periods where human presence seems to diminish in certain regions, followed by reappearance later. This raises questions. Did populations collapse? Did they move? Did they adapt in ways that made their presence archaeologically invisible? Climate shifts provide one explanation. Changing rainfall patterns, advancing ice or rising seas can render regions temporarily uninhabitable. People leave, survive elsewhere, and return generations later. In the meantime, the land erases their traces. But climate is not the only factor. Disease, social fragmentation, or resource depletion can also reduce populations without eliminating them entirely. A culture can thin out, simplify, and persist quietly until conditions allow complexity to re-emerge. From the outside, this looks like disappearance and reappearance. From the inside, it is continuity under constraint. One of the most intriguing gaps is cultural rather than material. We see long stretches where symbolic expression is rare or inconsistent, followed by periods rich in art, ornamentation, and ritual objects. This has sometimes been framed as a cognitive leap, as though humans suddenly became capable of abstract thought. But symbolic behaviour likely existed long before it left durable traces. Body paint, dance, music, storytelling, and ephemeral art leave little behind. They can shape identity and social cohesion profoundly without producing objects that survive. The absence of symbols in the archaeological record does not mean absence of meaning. It means absence of preservation. There are also gaps introduced by our own categorization. We divide history into periods with names and boundaries, but those boundaries are artificial. They reflect our need for organization, not lived reality. People did not wake up one day and realize they had entered a new age. These divisions can obscure continuity. Practices that persist across periods may be overlooked because they do not fit neatly into a category. Transitions appear sharper than they were. Gaps are emphasized where there were gradients. Another important source of gaps is geographic bias. Certain regions are studied intensively, while others remain underexplored. Political instability, funding limitations, and accessibility all influence where research occurs. As a result, the global timeline is stitched together unevenly. This means that some regions appear central to human development simply because we know more about them. Others appear peripheral or silent, not because nothing happened there, but because we have not looked deeply enough or effectively enough. The timeline we hold is not a neutral record. It is a patchwork influenced by chance, interest, and circumstance. Technological gaps are also revealing. There are periods where certain technologies appear, disappear, and later reappear independently. This suggests that knowledge can be lost and rediscovered. It challenges the assumption that progress is cumulative. Fire-making techniques, navigation skills, and even agricultural practices have been forgotten in some contexts and reinvented in others. When a skill depends on tradition rather than documentation, it is vulnerable. Once the chain breaks, rebuilding takes time. This vulnerability creates invisible valleys in the timeline, periods where capability drops, not because intelligence declines, but because continuity fails. Perhaps the most uncomfortable gaps are those we do not know how to frame at all. Anomalies that do not fit expected sequences, artifacts found out of context, dates that challenge established timelines. These are often treated cautiously, sometimes dismissed, sometimes set aside until they can be explained. Caution is necessary. Extraordinary claims require strong evidence, but caution can also harden into resistance. When a finding threatens a well-established narrative, it faces higher scrutiny. This is not malicious, it is human. Paradigms provide stability. Challenging them creates uncertainty. As a result, some gaps persist not because they cannot be filled, but because filling them would require rethinking comfortable assumptions. It is important to be clear here. Gaps do not automatically imply advanced lost civilizations or forgotten golden ages. They imply uncertainty. They point to the limits of our knowledge. They invite questions rather than conclusions, but uncertainty itself is meaningful. It reminds us that the timeline is not a complete map. It is a sketch drawn with missing sections, smudges, and erased lines. When we imagine civilizations before us, these gaps take on new significance. They become spaces where complexity could have existed without leaving obvious traces. They become intervals where rise and fall could have occurred quietly. Even if no such civilizations existed, the gaps still matter. They show how fragile memory is, how easily stories are lost, how dependent our understanding is on chance preservation. Looking at humanity's timeline this way does not diminish what we know. It deepens it. It adds humility. It shifts the focus from certainty to curiosity. The strange gaps are not failures of science. They are invitations. They tell us where questions remain open. They remind us that the past is larger than the record that reaches us. There is a moment in humanity's story that often feels abrupt when you first encounter it. One page turns, and suddenly stone tools are refined. Fire is controlled with confidence, and knowledge seems to consolidate into systems rather than isolated skills. It can feel as though something clicked all at once, as though humans crossed a threshold and emerged changed. This impression is not born from drama in the past, but from compression in the record. Stone, fire, and knowledge did not appear suddenly to the people who lived through their development. They unfolded slowly, unevenly, shaped by trial, failure, and local conditions. But when we look back across vast stretches of time, gradual changes can collapse into sharp edges. What took thousands of years to refine can look like a leap when the intermediate steps are missing. Stone tools are a good place to begin because they anchor much of what we think we know about early humans. Stone survives. It resists decay. It can sit in the ground for hundreds of thousands of years and still announce itself clearly. That durability makes stone tools feel like reliable markers of progress. But they are only markers of what survived, not necessarily of what mattered most. For long stretches of time, stone tool forms appear remarkably consistent. Then, in certain layers, complexity increases, edges become sharper, shapes diversify. Techniques appear that require planning, teaching, and practice. To the modern eye, it can look as though a new way of thinking emerged almost overnight. But stone tools are the end result of a much larger process. Behind every refined blade lies countless hours of experimentation, failed strikes, broken cores, adjustments made by feel rather than formula. Knowledge passed hand to hand, not through instruction manuals, but through observation and repetition. None of that leaves a clear trace. The record captures the successful moments, not the long learning curve that produced them. When those successful forms appear clustered in time, it creates the illusion of sudden invention. Fire tells a similar story. The controlled use of fire is often framed as a dramatic turning point, a single discovery that transformed humanity. In reality, fire use likely emerged gradually and unevenly. Natural fires existed long before humans learned to harness them. Lightning strikes, volcanic activity, wildfires. Early humans would have encountered fire repeatedly, observed its behavior, learned its dangers and benefits. The transition from opportunistic use to deliberate control was not a single step. It required learning how to maintain embers, how to transport heat, how to manage fuel, how to avoid burns, how to keep flames alive through weather and time. These skills would have developed incrementally, passed down through demonstration rather than explanation. The archaeological evidence for early fire use is sparse and debated precisely because fire leaves little behind. Ash scatters, charcoal degrades, hearths erode. A fire that burns briefly in an open area may leave no trace at all after enough time has passed. Even repeated use can vanish under shifting sediments or biological activity. So when we find consistent evidence of fire use, it feels sudden. But what we are seeing is not the beginning. It is the moment when use became frequent enough, stable enough, and localized enough to leave a detectable signal. Knowledge follows the same pattern. Knowledge does not fossilize. It lives in people. It accumulates quietly. It is lost easily. When conditions favor continuity, knowledge deepens. When continuity breaks, knowledge fragments. In the archaeological record, knowledge appears indirectly through tools, structures, and patterns of behavior. When those patterns become more complex, it can seem as though knowledge itself expanded rapidly. But what we may be seeing is a threshold of visibility rather than a threshold of capability. Consider how much knowledge is required to produce even a simple stone blade efficiently. Understanding the properties of different rocks, knowing where to find them, anticipating fracture patterns, adjusting force and angle, teaching others to do the same. This is not instinct, it is learned expertise. Now imagine that expertise refined over generations, shared within groups, adapted to local materials. That knowledge could exist for a very long time before leaving behind artifacts that we would classify as advanced. The same applies to social knowledge. Organising groups, resolving conflict, coordinating hunts, caring for children and the injured, maintaining alliances. These are complex skills. They require communication, memory, empathy, and planning. They are foundational to civilization, yet they leave almost no physical trace. When we see sudden increases in settlement complexity or tool diversity, we may be witnessing the moment when social and technical knowledge aligned with environmental stability, a stable climate, reliable resources, enough population density to support specialization. Under those conditions, knowledge that already existed could express itself more visibly. This is especially important when thinking about early periods where multiple advancements seem to cluster. It is tempting to imagine a spark, a breakthrough that changed everything, but sparks are less likely than slow accumulation followed by release. Think of pressure building behind a dam. For a long time nothing seems to happen. Then, once a threshold is reached, water spills over rapidly. To an observer downstream it looks sudden, but the build-up took time. In the same way, stone refinement, fire mastery and knowledge organisation likely built quietly, constrained by environment and circumstance. When those constraints eased, expression accelerated. There is also the matter of selective survival. Certain materials preserve knowledge better than others. Stone preserves form. Fire preserves traces only under specific conditions. Organic materials, which likely played a huge role in early technology, almost always vanish. Wood, fibre, leather, plant resins, adhesives, baskets, nets, clothing. These materials are essential to daily life and technological sophistication. They shape how people move, hunt, build, and interact. Yet they rarely survive beyond a few thousand years unless preserved in extreme environments. If early humans developed complex technologies using organic materials, we would not see them clearly. We would only see the stone components that happen to endure. That skews our perception. It makes progress look spikier than it was. Fire itself enabled many organic technologies. Heat-treated wood, hardened tips, processed fibres, cooked foods that change nutrition and cognition. These developments leave indirect signals, if any. When we detect them at all, it is often through subtle chemical residues or patterns of wear. Because of this, there may be long periods where stone tools appear simple, while organic technologies advance unseen. When stone tools finally reflect those advancements, it looks like a leap. In reality, the leap happened elsewhere and earlier. Knowledge also spreads unevenly. Innovations do not move at the same speed everywhere. Some groups adopt new techniques quickly, others do not. Some environments reward innovation, others punish it. A technique that works well in one place may be useless in another. This creates patchiness in the record. Advanced tools appear in one region, while neighbouring areas remain unchanged. Later, the pattern reverses or spreads. To us, this can look like sudden emergence and disappearance. To those living through it, it would feel like gradual diffusion interrupted by setbacks. Fire, stone, and knowledge are also interconnected. Mastery in one area reinforces the others. Fire enables better tool-making. Better tools enable improved resource access. Improved resources support learning and teaching. These feedback loops can accelerate development once they are established. Before that point, progress may be slow and fragile. One lost generation can break the chain. One environmental shock can reset practices. Knowledge can retreat as quickly as it advances. This fragility matters when considering why things appear suddenly. A long build-up can be erased by collapse, leaving only the later reappearance visible. If a technique is developed, lost, and later rediscovered, the record may only capture the rediscovery. There is evidence that this kind of loss and re-emergence has happened multiple times. Certain tool-making techniques appear, vanish, and later return independently. Fire use shows similar patterns. These are not straight lines of progress. They are pulses. Pulses fit better with the idea of repeated rises and falls than with a single, uninterrupted ascent. They suggest that humans have always been capable of more than they could consistently maintain. Another factor is population size. Knowledge thrives in numbers. Larger populations can support specialists. They preserve diversity of skills. They recover from loss more easily. Smaller populations are more vulnerable. A few deaths can erase entire practices. During periods when human populations were sparse, even advanced knowledge would be precarious. It might exist intensely in one group and vanish completely in another. Over time, this creates a flickering pattern of advancement. When population densities increase, knowledge stabilizes. Practices become traditions. Techniques are standardized. The archaeological signal strengthens. From our perspective, this looks like a sudden consolidation of civilization. But consolidation is not creation, it is visibility. The phrase, appear too suddenly, is revealing. It tells us more about our vantage point than about the past. We're looking through a narrow window, peering across immense time, relying on fragments that survived by chance. Suddenness emerges from absence. This does not mean that everything was always complex or that early humans lived in hidden advanced societies. It means that complexity does not announce itself reliably in the deep past. It means that our timelines are shaped as much by loss as by growth. When stone tools become refined, when fire use becomes widespread, when knowledge seems to crystallize into systems, we should be cautious about interpreting those moments as beginnings. They are often thresholds of preservation. This caution becomes even more important when we start considering larger-scale organization. Settlements, trade networks, shared belief systems. These things may have existed earlier in forms that left a little behind. When they later reappear in more durable forms, they feel unprecedented. The Earth has a way of filtering history, letting through only certain frequencies. Durable materials, catastrophic burials, stable climates. Everything else fades into background noise. When the signal strengthens, it can feel like a sudden broadcast. As we move forward in this exploration, the pattern continues to repeat. What seems abrupt is often cumulative. What seems new is often a return. What looks like a beginning may be a resurfacing after a long silence, and that raises a larger, more unsettling question. If stone, fire, and knowledge can appear suddenly because their earlier histories were erased or muted, then how many other developments might have followed the same pattern? How many times might complexity have risen quietly, only to be broken apart before it could leave a lasting mark? Once that possibility enters the conversation, it becomes harder to see humanity's story as a single arc. It begins to resemble something more fragile, a series of attempts shaped by forces far larger than any one group, each leaving traces that flicker in and out of view. There is a deeply ingrained idea that sits quietly behind most modern thinking, so familiar that it often goes unnoticed. It is the idea that progress moves forward, steadily, and irreversibly. That once something is learned, it stays learned. Once a society reaches a certain level of complexity, it does not truly go backward. It might stumble, it might slow, but the overall direction is assumed to be upward. This idea feels natural because it aligns with our recent experience. Over the last few centuries, technology has accelerated, knowledge has accumulated, communication has expanded. Each generation inherits tools and information that the previous one did not have. From within this window of time, progress looks like a one-way street. But this window is narrow. It sits inside an unusually stable and interconnected period of history. When you widen the view, stretching it across thousands or tens of thousands of years, the assumption begins to wobble. Progress, it turns out, is not a law of nature. It is a condition, and conditions change. One of the first problems with the idea of always forward progress is that it confuses potential with permanence. Humans have always had the potential for complex thought, creativity, and problem solving. That potential does not guarantee sustained outcomes. Intelligence alone does not preserve knowledge. Continuity does. Knowledge survives only when it is maintained. It must be taught, practiced, reinforced, and adapted. Remove the structures that support it, and it degrades quickly. This is not a flaw of early societies. It is a property of all complex systems. We can see this even in small modern examples. Skills disappear within a generation when they are no longer needed. Trades vanish. Languages die. Techniques once common become obscure. Not because they were inferior, but because the systems that supported them dissolved. Scale that up, and the same principle applies to entire civilizations. The archaeological record is filled with examples of regression. After the collapse of centralized states, populations often revert to simpler technologies. Writing disappears. Architecture becomes less durable. Trade networks shrink. Specialization declines. These changes are sometimes framed as dark ages, but that framing is misleading. What actually happens is a reorganization around survival rather than complexity. Progress did not reverse because people became less intelligent. It reversed because the conditions that sustained complexity no longer existed. This is where the linear model of progress begins to fail. It assumes that knowledge accumulates independently of context. In reality, knowledge is context dependent. Advanced metallurgy requires stable supply chains. Writing systems require institutions. Large-scale construction requires coordination and surplus. Remove any of these, and the associated knowledge becomes impractical, then irrelevant, then forgotten. There is also a psychological bias at work. We tend to judge progress by visible outputs. Taller buildings, faster machines, more intricate tools. But visibility is not the same as advancement. A society may choose stability over expansion. It may optimize for resilience rather than growth. From the outside, this can look like stagnation or regression, even if it represents a deliberate adaptation. The assumption that progress must always move forward also relies on the idea that history is cumulative. But history is selective. It keeps what survives, not what existed. We mistake survival for superiority. Many technologies that disappeared were not inferior. They were simply tied to environments or social structures that no longer existed. When those contexts vanished, the technologies went with them. Fire-making techniques provide a simple example. There are documented cases where groups lost the ability to make fire and had to preserve embers continuously. If those embers went out, the knowledge was gone. The capability did not vanish because it was unimportant. It vanished because the transmission chain broke. Navigation offers another example. Polynesian wayfinding relied on deep observational knowledge of stars, currents, winds, and wildlife. It was extraordinarily sophisticated, but it existed almost entirely in memory. When colonial systems disrupted cultural continuity, much of that knowledge disappeared. It is now being painstakingly reconstructed. Not because it was primitive, but because it was fragile. These are not isolated cases. They illustrate a broader truth. Progress is not stored safely in the human mind by default. It is stored in systems, and systems fail. The idea of inevitable forward motion also struggles with environmental reality. The Earth does not provide constant conditions. Climate shifts, resources fluctuate, landscapes transform. A technique that works brilliantly in one era may be useless or dangerous in another. Agriculture itself, often cited as a cornerstone of progress, has collapsed repeatedly in different regions due to soil depletion, drought, salinization, or social strain. When that happens, societies simplify, diets change, settlements shrink or move, complexity recedes. From a linear perspective, this looks like failure. From an adaptive perspective, it looks like survival. Another problem with the forward-only model is that it encourages complacency. If progress is assumed to be automatic, then preservation feels unnecessary. Knowledge appears self-sustaining. In reality, it is anything but. Even today, vast amounts of information exist only in digital form. Without electricity, without servers, without maintenance, that information vanishes. Books decay, formats become obsolete, languages shift. We are far more vulnerable to loss than we like to admit. Earlier societies were no different. Their vulnerability was simply expressed through different mediums. When we imagine earlier civilizations, we often picture them building toward us, as though history had us in mind. This teleological thinking is comforting, but inaccurate. No civilization knows it is part of a sequence. Each one experiences itself as the present, adapting to immediate conditions. Progress, when it happens, is often accidental. A solution emerges because it works, not because it advances a grand narrative. When it stops working, it is abandoned without ceremony. The forward progress model also tends to erase failure from the story. Failed experiments, collapsed systems, lost knowledge. These are treated as footnotes rather than central features. But failure is not an exception in history. It is the norm. Most social experiments do not persist. Most technological paths are abandoned. Most ways of organizing people do not scale or endure. What remains is a thin slice that happened to align with stable conditions long enough to leave a mark. This selective survival creates the illusion of inevitability. Looking backward, it feels as though the path to the present was clear. Looking forward, it feels uncertain. That asymmetry is not because the past was simpler. It is because we see only the outcomes that survived. If multiple civilizations existed before us, the forward-only model becomes even more problematic. It would require that each one independently climbed a similar ladder and then vanished without leaving obvious successors. That sounds unlikely only if you assume the ladder exists. If, instead, civilization is a pattern that emerges under certain conditions and dissolves. When those conditions fail, repetition becomes plausible. Rise is not guaranteed to lead anywhere permanent. It leads only as far as stability allows. This reframes the idea of being the seventh civilization. It does not imply that 6 others marched forward toward us and then disappeared mysteriously. It implies that complexity has surfaced multiple times, in different forms, under different constraints, and then retreated. In that context, progress is not a vector. It is a pulse. Pulses can be strong or weak, long or short. They can overlap or fade. They do not have destinations. They have durations. The problem with insisting that progress always moves forward is that it blinds us to these patterns. It makes collapse feel unthinkable until it is unavoidable. It makes loss feel anomalous rather than expected. When we accept that progress is conditional, our relationship with the past changes. Earlier societies stop looking like incomplete versions of us and start looking like complete systems in their own right. Systems that worked until they didn't. It also changes how we view the present. Our technologies are impressive, but they are brittle. Our knowledge is vast, but it is fragmented. Our systems are powerful, but tightly coupled. Small failures can cascade. None of this is meant to predict collapse or glorify it. It is meant to restore realism. Forward motion is not guaranteed. It must be actively supported. When you remove the assumption of inevitability, the past opens up. It becomes easier to imagine long arcs of advancement that did not lead here. Civilizations that solved problems we have forgotten how to frame. Knowledge that mattered deeply in its time and then vanished quietly. And once that door opens, the next question follows naturally. If progress does not always move forward, then what kinds of forces are capable of stopping it entirely? Imagine for a moment trying to remove every sign that a complex society ever existed. Not just topple its buildings or scatter its people, but erase it so thoroughly that future observers would debate whether it was ever there at all. This is not a simple task, and it is worth understanding why, because doing so reveals just how powerful the forces involved would have to be, and how indifferent they would need to be to human intention. Erasing a world does not require malice. It does not require planning. In fact, the most effective erasers operate without awareness, without memory, and without any concern for what they remove. They work slowly or suddenly, locally or globally, but always with the same result. Complexity collapses, patterns dissolve, and meaning fades into background noise. The first thing to recognize is that civilizations are not single objects. They are networks, cities, roads, farms, tools, languages, customs, and knowledge all depend on each other. Remove enough connections and the structure fails even if many components remain. What is left behind may still exist physically, but it no longer functions as a civilization. This matters because erasure does not require total destruction. It requires disconnection. A society can lose its ability to transmit knowledge long before it loses its people. If specialists disappear, if institutions fail, if education breaks down, knowledge fragments quickly. Skills that took generations to refine can vanish in a single lifetime. Once gone, rebuilding them without records is extraordinarily difficult. We often imagine erasure as violent and sudden. Firestorms, impacts, floods sweeping everything away in dramatic fashion. Those events do happen, and when they do, they leave unmistakable scars. But erasure more often works through layered processes, subtle ones, persistent ones, forces that do not announce themselves as endings. Climate is one of the most effective of these forces, not because it is hostile by default, but because it reshapes what is possible. A stable climate supports agriculture, predictable seasons, and long-term planning. A shifting climate undermines all of that quietly. Extended droughts collapse food systems. Changing rainfall patterns turn fertile regions into marginal ones. Cooling periods shorten growing seasons. Warming periods bring floods, storms, and rising seas. None of these need to kill everyone. They only need to disrupt continuity. Once people are forced to move repeatedly, to prioritize immediate survival over long-term organization, complexity fades. Permanent structures become liabilities. Knowledge tied to specific places loses relevance. Social systems simplify because they must. Over generations, what was once a civilization becomes a series of adaptations. From the outside, it looks like disappearance. From the inside, it feels like endurance. Water is another powerful eraser, not just through floods, but through patience. Rivers do not destroy everything at once. They migrate. They undercut banks. They deposit sediment. Over centuries, they bury entire landscapes under layers of silt. Structures disappear not because they are smashed, but because they are slowly entombed. Coastlines are even more unforgiving. Rising seas do not negotiate, they advance. Settlements near water are productive and connected, but they are also temporary. When sea levels rise, people retreat inland. What they leave behind is claimed by currents, storms, and sediment. Within a few thousand years, those places are not ruins, they are seabeds. Even now, much of the land that was habitable during earlier periods lies underwater, not hidden deliberately, simply inaccessible. Any civilization that flourished there would have its core erased not by violence, but by depth. Ice is quieter, but no less effective. Advancing glaciers scrape landscapes clean. They crush rock into powder. They carry debris for hundreds of kilometers. When they retreat, they leave behind altered terrain and scattered remnants that are difficult to interpret. If settlements existed in regions later covered by ice, the evidence would be fragmented, displaced, and often destroyed entirely. Glacial cycles repeat. Over time, they reset large portions of the planet. Fire too erases in more ways than burning. Wildfires reshape ecosystems. They clear forests. They alter soil chemistry. They remove organic material rapidly. Repeated fire cycles can erase surface traces and prevent long-term accumulation of debris that might otherwise preserve signs of habitation. Volcanic activity combines several erasing forces at once. Lava flows bury landscapes. Ash suffocates ecosystems. Climate is altered temporarily or even for decades. Survivors flee. Regions are abandoned. When life returns, it builds on top of a blank slate. In rare cases, volcanic ash preserves moments with remarkable clarity. But those cases are exceptions. More often, eruptions erase without recording. Then there is biology. Plants, animals, fungi, and microbes are relentless recyclers. Roots crack stone. Microbes digest organic remains. Insects tunnel through soil. Forests reclaim cleared land rapidly. In tropical environments especially, decay is swift and thorough. A wooden structure can disappear within decades. A settlement built from organic materials can vanish within a few centuries. Without stone or metal, little remains that we would recognize as intentional. This biological erasure is ongoing and cumulative. It does not stop. It does not pause. It works everywhere life exists. Time itself is perhaps the most underestimated factor. We are accustomed to thinking in years, maybe centuries. Geological processes operate over millennia. Over those spans, even dramatic events fade. A collapsed building becomes rubble. Rubble becomes sediment. Sediment becomes rock. Rock erodes. The signal degrades at every stage. For something to survive clearly, it must either be buried quickly under protective conditions or made of materials resistant to weathering. Even then, survival is not guaranteed. Now consider what would need to happen to erase not just structures, but memory. This is where social collapse plays a central role. Writing is fragile. It depends on materials, literacy, and continuity. Lose any of those, and written knowledge becomes inert. Without readers, texts are meaningless. Without copying, they decay. Libraries burn. Scripts become undecipherable. Languages shift. Oral knowledge is even more vulnerable. It lives entirely in people. Once disrupted, it leaves no trace. A civilization can lose its memory while many of its people remain alive. This can happen through conquest, disease, forced migration, or internal fragmentation. Elders die. Teachers disappear. Traditions are interrupted. What survives is simplified. Over generations, even the memory of complexity fades. Stories become myths. Myths become metaphors. Metaphors lose context. Eventually, silence. This is one of the most complete forms of erasure. Physical remnants may still exist, but without cultural continuity, they are unreadable. Later societies may repurpose ruins without understanding them. Stones are reused. Sites are built over. The original meaning dissolves. What remains is shape without story. Erasing a world also does not require global reach. Localized erasure repeated across time can achieve the same effect. If complexity arises in pockets and those pockets are disrupted repeatedly, nothing accumulates long enough to persist. This fits well with a planet that is uneven in stability. Some regions support long-term settlement. others do not. A civilization that spreads across unstable zones may never leave a concentrated core that survives intact. It is also important to remember that humans are part of the erasing process. Later societies dismantle earlier ones. Materials are scavenged. Landscapes are reshaped. Memory is overwritten by new narratives. This is not done with intent to erase history. It is done out of practicality. Why quarry new stone when old stone is available? Why preserve ruins when land is needed? Over time, reuse becomes erasure. Even now, modern development destroys archaeological sites daily, not out of malice, but out of necessity or neglect. The past is fragile when the present is hungry. To erase a world, then, does not require a single apocalypse. It requires alignment, environmental instability, biological activity, social disruption, time. Enough of these working together will dissolve almost anything. This is why the absence of evidence is such a weak argument against deep history. The default outcome of time is erasure. Preservation is the anomaly. When we ask what it would take to erase a world, the unsettling answer is not much more than what the Earth already does. Given enough time and the right conditions, even the most elaborate systems unravel. This does not mean that entire advanced civilizations must have existed and vanished. It means that if they did, erasure is plausible. It fits what we know about the planet. It aligns with how fragile complexity is. It also forces a reconsideration of how we define survival. A civilization does not survive because it was advanced. It survives because conditions allowed its traces to persist and be recognized. Many things that matter deeply do not survive. They simply end. Understanding this shifts the tone of the question. Instead of asking how such civilizations could disappear without a trace, we begin to ask how anything survives at all. Across the long history of this planet, there are moments when change does not arrive gradually. Instead, it sweeps in, fast enough that adaptation lags behind it, and systems built on stability simply fail. These moments are not rare exceptions. They are recurring features of Earth's behaviour. Floods, fire, and ice are not disasters in the moral sense. They are mechanisms, and together they function like a reset button that the planet presses from time to time, without consultation. Floods are perhaps the most deceptive of these forces, because water is usually associated with life, fertility, and renewal. Rivers nourish crops, rain sustains ecosystems. But water, when it exceeds expectation, becomes one of the most efficient erasers imaginable. Not because it destroys everything violently, but because it rearranges landscapes so completely that what came before loses its context. Large floods do not simply wash structures away, they bury them. Layer after layer of sediment settles out of moving water, sealing surfaces under mud, sand, and debris. A city does not need to collapse to disappear. It only needs to be covered deeply enough that no one returns to clear it. Over centuries, buried landscapes compress. Organic material decays, wood rots, metals corrode, stone cracks under pressure. Eventually, what was once a living environment becomes a geological layer. From above, it looks like flat ground. From below, it is a palimpsest, overwritten again and again. Flooding also drives migration. When rivers change course or floodplains become unreliable, people leave. They take what they can carry. They abandon what they cannot. Knowledge tied to place is disrupted. Farming systems fail. Trade routes dissolve. Even if people survive, continuity does not. There are flood myths in cultures all over the world, and while myths are not records in the scientific sense, their persistence is telling. Flooding is memorable because it reshapes everything quickly. It leaves survivors with a sense that something fundamental has ended and something unfamiliar has begun. On geological timescales, floods are not always singular events. Meltwater pulses at the end of ice ages release enormous volumes of water in short periods. Glacial lakes burst. Ice dams fail. Entire regions are scoured clean. These events leave scars that can still be seen, but they also erase what existed before them. If a civilization were established in a region vulnerable to such events, it would not matter how well organized or knowledgeable it was. Its infrastructure would be dismantled in days. Its land would be altered beyond recognition. What remained would be scattered fragments, disconnected from their original meaning. Fire operates differently, but no less thoroughly. Unlike floods, fire does not bury. It strips. It removes organic matter rapidly, converting years of accumulation into ash and gas. In ecosystems that experience repeated fires, long-term structures struggle to persist unless actively maintained. Wildfires are natural parts of many environments. They clear undergrowth, they recycle nutrients, they shape plant communities. But when fire frequency or intensity increases beyond historical patterns, it becomes destabilizing. Settlements built from organic materials vanish quickly. Food stores burn. Forests that once provided resources disappear. Fire also alters soil chemistry. In some cases, it makes land temporarily fertile. In others, it renders it hostile to growth. Erosion often follows, as vegetation that once held soil in place is removed. Rain then carries that soil away, compounding the damage. For societies dependent on local resources, repeated fires can force abandonment. People move on, they rebuild elsewhere. Over time, memory of the original settlement fades, especially if it is not reoccupied. Fire has another subtler effect. It accelerates decay. Heat weakens stone. It fractures rock. It speeds chemical reactions. Materials that might otherwise survive longer degrade faster after exposure to high temperatures. Volcanic fire combines all of this with burial. Lava flows entomb landscapes, ash blankets regions, air quality deteriorates, crops fail, climate shifts temporarily or even for decades, populations disperse. In rare cases, volcanic ash preserves moments with astonishing detail. But preservation is incidental. The primary effect is disruption. Entire regions can become uninhabitable. Even after conditions improve, returning populations may not rebuild in the same way. The past is not restored, it is replaced. Ice is perhaps the most patient and ruthless of these forces. Glaciers advance slowly, but their impact is profound. As they move, they grind rock into powder, they scrape surfaces clean, they pick up debris and carry it far from its origin. When they retreat, they leave behind landscapes that are flattened, scoured and rearranged. Anything that existed in the path of ice is either destroyed or displaced. Structures are crushed, artifacts are broken and scattered. Soil is removed entirely in some places. What remains is often out of context, making interpretation difficult. Glacial cycles have repeated many times in Earth's recent history. During ice ages, large portions of the planet become uninhabitable. Human populations retreat to refuges. Knowledge becomes localized. Networks fragment. When the ice retreats, people spread again. They recolonize land that looks new, even though it has a deep past. If earlier settlements existed there, their traces are minimal. The reset is nearly complete. Ice also lowers sea levels by trapping water on land. Coastlines extend. Continental shelves become habitable plains. People settle there, drawn by resources. When the climate warms, ice melts, sea levels rise, and those settlements drown. This cycle alone could erase multiple chapters of human habitation. Coastal regions are prime locations for civilization. They offer food, trade, and transport. They are also temporary on geological timescales. Fire, flood, and ice do not operate in isolation. They interact. A warming climate melts ice, raising seas and increasing floods. Drought increases fire risk. Fire removes vegetation, increasing erosion and flood severity. These feedback loops amplify disruption. From the perspective of a civilization living through such changes, the experience would not feel like a single event. It would feel like a series of crises, one adaptation after another, each one manageable on its own, but collectively overwhelming. At some point, complexity becomes a liability. Large settlements are harder to move. Specialized knowledge is harder to preserve. Infrastructure becomes brittle. Simpler ways of living offer resilience. This transition is not a moral failure. It is a practical response. But from the outside, looking back, it appears as disappearance. The idea of a planetary reset does not imply a conscious mechanism. There is no intention. The Earth is not correcting mistakes. It is responding to physical laws. Energy moves, heat flows, ice accumulates, water seeks level. These processes are indifferent to culture. They do not care whether a structure is sacred or mundane. They do not preserve what humans value. They preserve what happens to survive. It is important to note that resets are rarely total. They do not wipe the slate clean in a uniform way. They create uneven survival. Some regions are devastated, others are spared. Some populations collapse, others persist. This unevenness matters because it shapes what follows. After a reset, survivors carry fragments of the past into new contexts. Techniques are simplified, traditions adapt, knowledge is reinterpreted. Over time, these fragments concede new complexity. But the new system is not a continuation. It is a reconstruction using whatever survived. This pattern aligns with what we see in the archaeological record. Discontinuities, reappearances, sudden shifts in material culture. These are not necessarily signs of innovation from nothing. They can be signs of rebuilding after disruption. The reset button does not return the planet to an earlier state. It creates a different configuration. Landscapes change, resources redistribute, constraints shift. A society that thrived before may not be viable after. A technique that once worked may fail. New solutions emerge, shaped by new conditions. This is why thinking of resets as endings is misleading. They are transitions, harsh ones but not absolute. Life continues, humans adapt, but continuity is broken. If multiple civilizations existed before us, they would not all be erased in the same way. Some might be buried, others burned, others drowned, others scattered by ice. Each reset would leave a different signature, or none at all. From our vantage point, these signatures blur together. Flood deposits look like natural sediment. Fire scars fade. Glacial debris is everywhere. Distinguishing cultural traces within these contexts is extraordinarily difficult. This difficulty feeds skepticism. If evidence is subtle or ambiguous, it is easy to dismiss. But subtlety is exactly what resets produce. The question is not whether floods, fire and ease can erase civilizations. They clearly can. The question is how often they have done so, and whether we are mistaking their work for absence rather than erasure. Once that possibility is taken seriously, the planet begins to look different. Not as a stable stage where history unfolds neatly, but as an active participant that periodically redraws the boundaries of what is possible. Sometimes what survives is not built to survive at all. Instead of walls or tools, what lingers are patterns, hints, repetitions that show up in places where physical evidence has thinned away. When resets sweep across the planet and erase most surface traces, they do not always silence everything. Some echoes travel differently. They move through stories, through shapes of land, through inherited assumptions about the world that no one remembers learning. These echoes are subtle. They do not announce themselves as records. They're easy to dismiss because they do not behave like data. Yet they persist across cultures and across time in ways that are difficult to explain if nothing ever came before. Myths are often the first place people look, and also the first place skepticism hardens. Myths are not history in the modern sense. They are not precise. They exaggerate. They adapt. They are shaped by metaphor and emotion rather than chronology. And yet myths are remarkably durable. They survive where documents do not. They travel where monuments cannot. Across the world, unrelated cultures tell stories that share unusual similarities. Floods that wipe out earlier peoples, fires that fall from the sky, ages of ice that trap the world in stillness, great teachers who arrive after destruction and help rebuild order. These themes appear in places separated by oceans and millennia. It is tempting to explain this away as coincidence or as reflections of universal human fears. Water, fire, and cold are common threats after all. But the consistency goes beyond vague danger. In many traditions, floods are not seasonal events. They are world-ending. They are resets. What comes after is not continuation, but a new age. In these stories, the survivors often do not rebuild exactly what was lost. They inherit fragments, instructions, laws, techniques. Sometimes these are said to come from gods, spirits, or ancestors. That framing makes sense in cultures without scientific language. Knowledge that appears without clear origin is easier to attribute to something beyond human reach. What matters is not whether these stories are literally true, but why they persist. Myths function as memory under conditions where precise memory cannot survive. They compress experience. They strip away detail and preserve structure. They are not records of events, but records of patterns. A civilization-ending flood becomes a story of cleansing and rebirth. A prolonged collapse becomes an age of darkness. Knowledge loss becomes divine punishment or cosmic forgetting. These narratives carry emotional truth even when factual details are blurred. Maps offer a different kind of echo. They are more constrained by reality, yet they too carry traces of things no longer visible. Early maps sometimes depict coastlines, islands, or land bridges that do not exist today. In many cases, these inaccuracies are explained as errors, guesses, or artistic license, but not all of them are easily dismissed. Some ancient maps show submerged features with surprising accuracy. Others preserve geographic relationships that only make sense if sea levels were lower. These details are often attributed to lost source maps or accumulated sailor knowledge. That explanation is reasonable. It also raises questions. Sailors do not map coastlines that are underwater. They map what they can see or what has been passed down. If certain features persist in cartographic traditions long after they vanish from the surface, it suggests continuity of information across major environmental change. That continuity does not require a global civilization. It only requires that some knowledge survived resets and was carried forward, adapted, simplified, and eventually misunderstood. Over time, the map becomes a relic of a landscape no one recognizes anymore. Mountains, too, hold echoes, though not in stories or symbols. They do so through shape. Some mountain formations show signs of modification that are difficult to explain purely through erosion. Terracing, unusual symmetry, flat plateaus at odd elevations. In many cases, these features are explained as natural processes, and often they are. But explanation does not always mean certainty. Geological processes are complex. Human modification can blend into natural patterns over enough time, especially if that modification occurred before modern industrial tools, using methods that worked with existing rock rather than against it. Terracing, for example, is a well-known agricultural practice. Over time, abandoned terraces erode, walls collapse, soil washes away. Eventually, what remains looks like a strange stepped hillside, easy to interpret as natural once the context is gone. Now imagine such practices repeated over thousands of years, then interrupted by a reset. What would survive would not look like farming. It would look like geology that behaves oddly. There are also mountains that play central roles in myth across cultures that had no contact. Sacred peaks, world mountains, places where heaven and earth meet. These locations are often geologically unusual. They stand apart visually. They attract attention. Humans build stories around them, but some of these mountains also show signs of long-term human interaction. Pathways carved into rock, platforms at high elevations, alignments with celestial events. Again, none of this proves a lost civilization, but it suggests long continuity of human focus, possibly across multiple cultural phases. What persists in these cases is not the civilization itself, but the significance attached to place. Even as societies change, certain locations retain importance. The story shifts, but the attention remains. Over time, meaning layers itself like sediment. Maps and myths intersect here. A sacred mountain appears on a map long after its original name is forgotten. A flood story references a place that no longer exists above water. A myth describes lands beyond the horizon that correspond to submerged plains. Each of these on its own is inconclusive. Together they suggest that memory does not vanish all at once. It degrades, it transforms, it relocates from fact into symbol. There is also the echo of lost time in language itself. Words persist long after their original meanings fade. Place names survive migrations. A river keeps a name even when its course changes. A mountain retains a title that no longer fits. Linguists sometimes trace words back to environments that no longer exist where the language is spoken. Terms for ice in tropical regions, words for forests in deserts. These are often explained as cultural inheritance, which is accurate. But inheritance implies an earlier context. That earlier context may have belonged to societies whose material traces are gone, but whose language fragments survived through adaptation. Another kind of echo appears in shared architectural instincts. Independent cultures build similar structures for similar reasons. Pyramidal shapes, for instance, appear in many places. They are stable. They're easy to build incrementally. They resist collapse. That alone does not imply connection. But when architectural choices align with symbolic meaning, celestial orientation, and geographic placement, patterns emerge, not of a single origin, but of repeated solutions to recurring problems. If civilizations rose and fell multiple times, each would rediscover certain forms. Over time, these forms would feel ancient, archetypal, as though they were always there. Memory of earlier usage would be gone, but the shape would return. Echoes are not blueprints. They do not tell us exactly what happened. They tell us that something keeps resurfacing, that certain ideas, locations, and patterns refuse to disappear entirely. Skepticism is healthy here. Humans are excellent at finding meaning where none exists. Confirmation bias is powerful, but skepticism cuts both ways. Dismissing all echoes as coincidence can be as limiting as overinterpreting them. The key is not to treat myths as records or maps as proof, but to see them as residues. They are what remains when precision is stripped away. They point toward disruption rather than continuity. In cultures that have experienced collapse, stories often emphasize renewal rather than loss. That makes sense psychologically. It is easier to frame the past as a moral lesson than as an unresolved tragedy. Over time, the lesson remains while the event fades. This reframing smooths sharp edges. Catastrophe becomes cleansing. Collapse becomes rebirth. The narrative survives because it is useful, not because it is accurate in detail. If earlier civilizations existed and were erased by planetary resets, the most likely traces would not be intact cities or advanced tools. They would be distortions in memory, persistent themes, geographic fixations, anomalies that resist tidy explanation. Mountains would still stand, reshaped but recognizable. Maps would preserve outlines long after meaning was lost. Myths would repeat patterns because patterns were what survived. The danger lies in expecting echoes to behave like evidence. They do not. They behave like ghosts. They are felt more than seen. They do not confirm, they suggest. This makes them uncomfortable for modern frameworks that demand clear causality and documentation. Echoes do not offer closure. They open questions. One of the most striking things about these echoes is that they often point backward beyond the limits of written history. They reference times before known cultures, before known coastlines, before stable climates. They hint at worlds that do not match the present configuration of the planet. That does not mean those worlds were more advanced. It means they were different, and difference is easy to erase. Long before telescopes refined the night sky into data and diagrams, long before equations gave stars names and distances, humans were already looking upward with attention that went beyond curiosity. The sky demanded it. It moved with patterns that affected seasons, migrations, tides, and survival itself. To ignore it was not an option. To study it was practical long before it became philosophical. When we think about ancient sky watching, we often frame it as primitive astronomy. Stone circles, simple alignments, rough calendars carved into rock, useful but limited. Yet that framing quietly underestimates what sustained observation over immense spans of time can produce, even without instruments or writing. You do not need glass lenses to notice that the sun's path shifts across the year. You do not need mathematics to track the moon's cycles. You do not need symbols to recognize that certain stars rise and set in predictable ways. What you need is patience, continuity, and collective memory. Those are exactly the things that become fragile during resets. If civilizations existed before ours, especially ones that endured long enough to stabilize, they would have learned the sky intimately. Not as an abstract domain, but as a reliable reference in a changing world. When the land shifts, the sky remains consistent. When floods erase boundaries, the stars still rise. This makes the sky a natural anchor for knowledge that needs to survive disruption. There is a reason so many early cultures embedded astronomical information into ritual, myth, and monument. When writing is absent or unreliable, embedding knowledge into behaviour and landscape is effective. A ceremony performed at a solstice encodes a calendar. A structure aligned to an equinox preserves orientation. A story about a constellation preserves seasonal timing. These methods do not look like science to us, but they are robust. They resist individual loss because they are distributed. Many people carry fragments. Even if some are lost, others persist. Now imagine that process unfolding over tens of thousands of years. Generations watching the sky, noting subtle changes, refining predictions. Precession, for example, shifts star positions slowly over millennia. Detecting it requires long continuity. It does not announce itself in a lifetime, and yet there are ancient structures and traditions that appear to account for long-term celestial cycles. Not perfectly, not explicitly, but with a degree of awareness that is difficult to explain as coincidence alone. This does not require lost advanced astronomy. It requires time. A civilization that endured long enough, even intermittently, could accumulate sky knowledge that feels disproportionate to its apparent material culture, and if that civilization later collapsed, its sky knowledge would not vanish entirely. It would degrade into symbolism. Constellations would remain, but their original meaning would blur. Alignments would persist, but their purpose would be forgotten. Calendrical rituals would survive, even as the logic behind them faded. This is where the idea of the ones who may have looked up before us becomes compelling. Not as a claim that earlier civilizations were technologically superior, but that they may have been temporally richer. They may have existed long enough to notice things we struggle to see, because our own continuity is fragmented. Modern astronomy advances rapidly, but it relies heavily on tools rather than time. Satellites replace patience, data replaces memory. This is efficient, but it also means our relationship with the sky is abstract. We understand it intellectually more than experientially. Earlier societies lived under the sky every night. No artificial light, no screens. The stars were not background. They were presence, orientation, clock. If resets occurred that erased much of their material culture, sky knowledge would be among the most likely things to persist, precisely because it is not tied to objects, it is tied to observation. There are hints of this in how widely distributed certain astronomical concepts are. The the division of the year into cycles, the identification of wandering stars, the recognition of eclipses as predictable rather than random. These ideas appear in multiple places independently, but not always at the same developmental stage. This unevenness suggests rediscovery layered over inheritance. Some groups relearned what others remembered faintly. Some encoded knowledge into myth because they lacked the means to preserve it explicitly. It is also worth considering what looking up meant psychologically. The sky invites pattern recognition. It encourages abstraction. It fosters a sense of scale beyond the immediate environment. These are cognitive shifts that influence how societies think about time, causality, and order. A culture that internalized long celestial cycles would think differently about permanence. It would be less surprised by change, more tolerant of collapse, more aware that conditions repeat, even if details differ. This perspective aligns uncomfortably well with the idea of repeated rises and falls. A civilization that expected stability to end would structure itself differently than one that assumed continuity. Sky knowledge also travels well. Unlike architecture, it does not require transport. Unlike tools, it does not decay. It can move with people as they migrate. Even when stripped of context, it remains useful. This may explain why some astronomical alignments appear in regions with no obvious architectural continuity. A group relocates, rebuilds slightly, but reorients structures to familiar celestial markers. Over time, the reason is forgotten, but the practice remains. There is also the question of why certain stars or patterns are emphasized across cultures. Orion, the Pleiades, the Milky Way. These features are visually striking, yes, but their consistent prominence suggests something more than aesthetic appeal. They mark seasonal transitions. They anchor navigation. They provide a shared reference frame. In environments where landmarks change, the sky is stable. If earlier civilizations existed and were erased by planetary resets, their most enduring legacy would likely not be physical. It would be orientational. The danger, again, is overinterpretation. Humans naturally converge on similar solutions. The sky is the same for everyone. Similar observations can lead to similar conclusions independently. But convergence does not exclude inheritance. Both can operate simultaneously. A practice may be rediscovered repeatedly because it works, and also remembered faintly because it once existed. What makes this area particularly difficult to study is that sky knowledge is rarely preserved explicitly in the deep past. It is inferred. It requires interpretation of alignments, myths, and ritual timing. Each inference carries uncertainty, yet uncertainty does not mean insignificance. It means caution. There are also patterns of loss here. In many cases, advanced astronomical understanding degrades rather than advances. Knowledge becomes ritualized. Calculations become ceremonies. Precision gives way to symbolism. This is exactly what you would expect if continuity were broken. The shell survives. The core dissolves. It is telling that some ancient structures are aligned with celestial events that would have occurred differently when they were built due to long-term astronomical shifts. This suggests either extraordinary foresight or, more plausibly, that the alignment was accurate at the time of construction and later drifted. That drift becomes a timestamp if you know how to read it. It tells you not just when something was built, but that someone cared enough to align it in the first place. Caring requires context. It requires that the alignment mattered, that it served a function beyond decoration. Now imagine that such structures were not isolated achievements, but remnants of broader systems of knowledge that mostly did not survive. What we see are anchor points, not the full map. This idea becomes even more interesting when you consider navigation. Long-distance sea travel without instruments requires sky mastery. The stars, winds, currents, and wildlife form an integrated system. Lose any part, and navigation becomes guesswork. Yet humans crossed oceans long before modern tools. This implies sustained observational knowledge passed across generations. When that knowledge was disrupted, it disappeared rapidly. Rediscovering it takes time, and time is exactly what resets disrupt. So when we ask who may have looked up before us, the answer does not have to be a singular lost civilization. It can be multiple societies, each inheriting fragments, each rebuilding under new constraints, each reorienting themselves to the sky, because it was the one thing that remained reliable. The sky becomes a continuity when everything else fractures. This perspective also softens the temptation to romanticize the past. Those who looked up before us were not necessarily wiser or more enlightened. They were attentive. Their attention was shaped by necessity. In a world where survival depended on seasons and movement, looking up was practical. In a world where infrastructure buffers us from immediate consequence, looking up becomes optional. If anything, the loss may be ours. As this thread settles, it prepares the ground for a harder question. If sky knowledge can persist across resets because it is distributed and experiential, what other kinds of knowledge might survive in similar ways? And what kinds are almost guaranteed to vanish? It begins with a small discomfort rather than a grand revelation, a sense that something about the usual story does not quite sit right when you stretch it over deep time. We are taught, almost instinctively, to think of ourselves as the beginning of something unprecedented, the first to build cities at scale, the first to unlock complex technology, the first to look outward with scientific intent. And yet, when you slow that narrative down and place it against the age and behaviour of the planet itself, that sense of being number one starts to feel less certain. The Earth is not young. It has hosted life for billions of years and complex life for hundreds of millions. In that span, it has tolerated enormous variation. Entire ecosystems have come and gone. Dominant species have risen, spread, and vanished. Nothing about the planet's history suggests that being first carries special protection, or that success guarantees continuity. If anything, the opposite seems to be true. The Earth experiments constantly, and it rarely repeats outcomes in exactly the same way. Against that backdrop, the idea that humanity's current civilization is the first and only complex attempt begins to feel like an assumption rather than a conclusion. Not because we have proof of 6 predecessors, but because the conditions for repetition are clearly present. Time is abundant. Intelligence has existed in our species for a very long time, and the mechanisms capable of erasing complexity are well documented. To say we might be number 7 is not to claim a precise count. The number itself is symbolic. It represents the possibility of multiple cycles rather than a single origin. It suggests that civilization is not a singular event, but a recurring pattern that emerges under certain conditions and dissolves when those conditions fail. One reason this idea feels uncomfortable is that we are culturally invested in uniqueness. Modern civilization frames itself as exceptional, not just in capability but in position. We sit at the top of a perceived ladder. Behind us is prehistory. Ahead of us is the future. That framing gives meaning to progress and justification to expansion. It also creates a narrative where the past is incomplete and the present is the fulfillment. But ladders are fragile metaphors when applied to complex systems. They imply direction and permanence. Nature rarely behaves that way. If we step away from metaphor and look instead at mechanisms, a different picture emerges. Civilization requires a narrow alignment of factors: stable climate, predictable resources, sufficient population density, knowledge continuity, social cohesion. None of these are guaranteed indefinitely. They fluctuate. They reinforce each other when conditions are right, and they unravel when conditions shift. Now consider how many times those alignments may have occurred in the last several 100,000 years. Humans have existed in recognizable form for at least 300,000 years. During that time, the planet has experienced multiple glacial cycles, sea level changes, and ecological reorganizations. Within those spans, there would have been windows of relative stability, long enough for complexity to emerge, long enough for societies to organise beyond simple survival. We already know that humans were capable of symbolic thought, long-term planning, and social coordination far earlier than once believed. The archaeological record continues to push dates backward. Art appears earlier, ritual appears earlier, tool sophistication appears earlier. Each discovery narrows the gap between cognitive capability and visible civilization. What remains uncertain is not whether humans could have organised complex societies earlier, but whether those societies would have left traces we're prepared to recognise. If a civilization arose in a favourable window and later encountered a reset, its trajectory would not look like ours. It would not lead neatly into agriculture, metallurgy, and writing in the same sequence. It would respond to its own constraints. When disrupted, it might simplify rather than escalate. Over time, its complexity could collapse back into subsistence strategies, carrying only fragments forward. From our perspective, that would look like an absence, a gap. But absence does not imply impossibility. It implies erasure or transformation. This is where the notion of being number 7 gains traction. Not as a claim of grandeur, but as an admission of humility. It acknowledges that we are operating inside a system that allows for repeated emergence and loss. That intelligence is not a one-shot event. That civilization is not an endpoint. The archaeological record, when viewed honestly, supports this humility more than it challenges it. We see repeated patterns of rise and collapse even within recorded history. Empires fragment, knowledge contracts, infrastructure decays, skills are lost. Later societies rediscover or reinvent what was forgotten. If this can happen within a few thousand years, under relatively stable climatic conditions, there is no reason to assume it could not have happened more dramatically over much longer spans. Another reason we resist the idea of prior civilizations is that we imagine them needing to resemble us. We look for steel, concrete, large-scale mining, global pollution. When we do not find these markers, we conclude that nothing comparable existed. But this expectation is narrow. It assumes that advancement must follow our path. It assumes that resource use must escalate. It assumes that technological expression must leave scars visible millions of years later. A civilization that optimized for balance rather than growth might leave a much lighter footprint, one that relied on renewable materials, localized systems, and cyclical resource use could function at high levels of organization without saturating the planet with durable waste. Such a civilization would be less visible archaeologically, not because it was primitive, but because it was restrained. Even our own civilization, despite its intensity, may not leave the kind of unmistakable layer we imagine. Given enough time, our cities will erode, our plastics will fragment, our digital records will vanish. What remains may confuse future observers more than enlighten them. If future archaeologists were to encounter only scattered anomalies from our era, they might debate whether a global civilization ever existed at all. They might argue that the evidence points to localized industrial activity rather than a unified system. They might be wrong, but they would be working with fragments. This thought experiment alone weakens the argument that absence of clear evidence disproves prior cycles. There is also a psychological factor at play. Being number 1 implies responsibility. Being number 7 implies precedent. It suggests that others have tried, succeeded for a time, and failed. That is a less comforting story, but perhaps a more realistic one. It also reframes innovation. We tend to see our achievements as breakthroughs rather than rediscoveries. But history is full of reinvention. Techniques, ideas, and systems emerge independently because they solve recurring problems. Writing, agriculture, metallurgy, and urbanization have all appeared multiple times in different places. If smaller-scale reinvention is common, larger-scale reinvention becomes plausible over longer spans. The idea of multiple civilizations does not require global dominance or advanced machines. It only requires sustained organisation beyond small bands, trade networks, shared norms, knowledge systems, long-term planning. These are achievable under many conditions. What matters is not how high a civilization climbs, but how it ends. A slow decline allows for memory. A rapid disruption does not. If earlier civilizations ended through environmental shifts, disease, or cascading social failures, their knowledge could vanish faster than their people. Over generations, the memory of complexity could be replaced by stories of a lost age, then by silence. This pattern appears repeatedly in known history. After collapses, survivors often describe the past as better organized, more abundant, more ordered. These descriptions may be exaggerated, but they reflect real loss of structure. Scale that loss up, and you begin to see how entire cycles could fade without leaving obvious monuments. Being number 7 also aligns with the unevenness of progress. We do not see a smooth trajectory from simplicity to complexity. We see bursts, long plateaus, regressions, accelerations. This fits better with a cyclical model than a linear one. In a cyclical model, civilizations are experiments. Some last longer, some collapse quickly, none are guaranteed permanence, each operates under unique constraints. Our current civilization is unusual in its global integration. That integration amplifies both resilience and vulnerability. It allows rapid knowledge sharing, but it also creates tight coupling. Failures propagate quickly, dependencies multiply. Earlier civilizations, if they existed, may have been more localized. Their collapses would be quieter globally, even if devastating locally. This makes them harder to detect across deep time. Another subtle reason we might be number 7 rather than number 1 lies in how we define beginnings. We often mark the start of civilization at agriculture or writing, but those are markers, not causes. They are thresholds of visibility. If earlier societies organised differently, they might not cross those thresholds in the same way. Their beginnings would be invisible to our definitions. In that sense, being number 1 is partly a semantic victory. We are the first by the standards we chose after the fact. There is also the matter of continuity bias. We know our own origin story because it survived. We assume it is unique because we can trace it. We forget that survival filters what we see. Imagine a future civilization studying the past after most records are gone. They might identify our era as the first because it is the earliest they can see clearly. That would not make it true. This does not mean we should accept the idea of multiple prior civilizations uncritically. Evidence matters. Skepticism is essential, but skepticism should be applied evenly, not selectively. It should question comforting narratives as rigorously as speculative ones. The idea that we are number 7 invites a different kind of thinking. It encourages us to see ourselves as participants in a longer process rather than protagonists in a final act. It suggests that civilization is something the planet allows temporarily, not something it guarantees. That perspective carries weight. It shifts focus from achievement to stewardship, from expansion to maintenance, from novelty to resilience. If others came before us and vanished, their absence is not a warning carved in stone. It is a silence, and silence is harder to interpret but no less meaningful. We do not need to know exactly how many times civilization has arisen to take the lesson seriously. One prior cycle would be enough. Even the possibility should be sobering. Because if we are not number 1, then we are not immune. Our technologies do not exempt us from the same forces. Our intelligence does not override planetary systems. Our records do not guarantee memory. What we build now exists within the same constraints that governed whatever came before. The same climate sensitivity, the same ecological limits, the same fragility of continuity. Seen this way, being number 7 is not a demotion, it is context. It places us within the Earth's long experimentation with complexity. It suggests that what matters is not whether we are first, but whether we are careful. Strip away the names, the dates, the monuments, and what remains of civilization becomes surprisingly hard to define. We often talk about civilizations as if they are solid objects, things that either exist or do not. Cities stand or fall, empires rise or collapse. But civilization is not a single structure. It is a layered arrangement of habits, knowledge, relationships and expectations, many of which are far more fragile than we like to admit. To ask how much of civilization can truly disappear is not to ask whether people can survive catastrophe. Humans are resilient. They adapt quickly. They endure. The deeper question is how much of what makes a civilization recognizable can vanish while people themselves continue on. And the answer, uncomfortable as it may be, is most of it. Civilization depends on continuity more than capability. The ability to build, organize, calculate, record, and coordinate is useless if it cannot be passed on reliably. Break that chain, and even the most sophisticated systems unravel with startling speed. This is not speculation. It has happened repeatedly, even within historical timescales that feel recent to us. Consider how quickly specialized knowledge disappears when it is no longer supported. A modern city contains millions of people, but only a small fraction understand how its systems truly work. Power grids, water treatment, telecommunications, medicine, logistics. Each depends on layers of expertise distributed across institutions. If those institutions fail, knowledge does not automatically diffuse. It fragments. People may remember outcomes without remembering processes. Lights once turned on, clean water once flowed, medicines once worked. Without the underlying systems, those memories are useless. Knowing that something existed is not the same as knowing how to recreate it. Now imagine that fragmentation unfolding not over decades, but across generations. Children grow up without seeing certain tools used. They learn different priorities. Knowledge that once seemed fundamental becomes irrelevant. Over time, even the memory that it ever mattered fades. This is how disappearance works, not as an explosion, but as erosion. Writing is often treated as civilization's anchor. As long as something is written down, we assume it can be recovered. But writing is only durable under very specific conditions. It requires materials that survive, languages that remain intelligible, and cultures that value preservation. Clay tablets last longer than paper, but only if they are buried properly. Paper lasts longer than digital files if it is protected from moisture, fire, and decay. Digital files last only as long as electricity, hardware, and compatible formats exist. Remove those supports, and information vanishes silently. Even when texts survive physically, meaning can be lost. Scripts become undecipherable, context disappears, symbols detach from usage. We already have examples of writing systems that remained unread for centuries, even when their physical form endured. This means that literacy alone does not guarantee memory. Continuity does. Architecture feels more solid, but it too is vulnerable. Buildings require maintenance. Without it, decay accelerates. Roofs collapse first, water enters, walls weaken, materials are scavenged. Within a few generations, even large structures can become quarries rather than landmarks. Later societies often reuse the remains of earlier ones. Stones are repurposed, foundations are built over, roads are buried. This is not malicious, it is efficient. Over time, original layouts become impossible to reconstruct because their components have been rearranged repeatedly. Entire cities have vanished this way, not because they were destroyed in a single event, but because they were gradually consumed by what came after. Technology, perhaps surprisingly, is one of the most fragile aspects of civilization. Advanced tools depend on supply chains, specialization, and scale. Remove any of these, and technology regresses quickly. Metalworking requires access to ore, fuel, and expertise. Without steady supply, it becomes impractical. Precision tools require infrastructure. Medicine requires sterile conditions, training, and distribution networks. Without these, practice simplifies or disappears. This does not mean people forget everything. It means they retain what is useful under new constraints. Civilization contracts to fit reality. Social structures are equally vulnerable. Complex governance systems require legitimacy, enforcement, and communication. When those break down, authority localizes, rules simplify, power becomes personal rather than institutional. Law codes are replaced by customs, bureaucracies dissolve into kinship networks, identity shifts from civic to familial or tribal. From the outside, this looks like regression. From the inside, it is adaptation. Religion and ritual often survive longer than formal institutions because they are embedded in behaviour rather than infrastructure. But even they change. Beliefs absorb new meanings. Old explanations are repurposed. Practices persist while origins are forgotten. This is why post-collapse cultures often retain symbols of earlier complexity without understanding them. A calendar continues to be observed long after the astronomical knowledge behind it is lost. A ceremony continues without its original function. Meaning drifts. Language too erodes. Vocabulary shrinks or shifts. Technical terms vanish first. Metaphors replace precision. Over generations, entire conceptual frameworks disappear simply because there are no words left to express them. This is a critical point. Thought depends on language. When language simplifies, certain kinds of thinking become difficult or impossible. Not because minds are weaker, but because tools are missing. Mathematics provides a clear example. Without formal notation and teaching, advanced mathematical concepts cannot be sustained. They require cumulative learning. Lose that, and mathematics returns to what is immediately useful. The same applies to astronomy, engineering, and philosophy. Abstract systems collapse without institutional support. If we step back and look at civilization as a whole, what emerges is a layered structure with uneven resilience. Some layers persist through disruption, others vanish almost immediately. Food knowledge tends to survive because it is essential. Shelter knowledge persists in simplified form. Social bonding remains. Storytelling endures. But large-scale coordination, abstract systems, and long-term planning are fragile. This uneven survival creates illusions when we look backward. We see people living simply and assume they always lived that way. We see a lack of complex tools and assume lack of complex thought. We mistake what remains for what existed. Now imagine this process repeating multiple times over deep time. A civilization emerges, develops complex systems, and then encounters a reset. Most of its complexity dissolves. Survivors adapt. Over generations, memory fades. Eventually a new civilization emerges, building again from what remains. From the outside, this looks like a single origin. From the inside, it is repetition. How much can disappear in this process? Almost everything that defines a civilization in textbooks. What might remain are scattered artifacts difficult to interpret. Unusual landscape modifications mistaken for natural features. Myths stripped of context. Calendars without explanation. Place names whose meanings no one remembers. Even genetics does not preserve civilization. DNA records population movement, not culture. A people can carry the genes of their ancestors while losing every aspect of their social organization. This is why the idea of total disappearance is misleading. People remain. Culture does not. The more complex a system, the more fragile it is. Complexity increases efficiency but reduces resilience. When disruption exceeds tolerance, collapse is rapid. Modern civilization is not exempt from this. In many ways, it is more vulnerable. Our systems are global and tightly coupled. A failure in one region can propagate quickly. Specialization is extreme. Redundancy is limited. We rely on continuous operation. Even short interruptions cause cascading effects. Food supply chains operate on narrow margins. Energy grids require constant balance. Data systems depend on uninterrupted power. If those systems were disrupted for extended periods, Much of what defines modern life would disappear within a single generation. Knowledge would not vanish instantly, but the ability to apply it would. Children raised in that context would not learn what their parents knew. They would learn what worked in their environment. Over time, complexity would retreat. This is not a prediction. It is an observation about how systems behave. Now consider this in light of deep time. If modern civilization can lose most of its complexity in decades under severe disruption, earlier civilizations with fewer durable supports would be even more vulnerable. This makes the idea of near-total disappearance not extraordinary, but expected. What tends to survive are things that do not require explanation. Basic tools, simple structures, adaptive behaviours. Everything else requires teaching. Teaching requires stability. Stability is rare. This also explains why archaeological records often show long periods of apparent simplicity following moments of complexity. It is not that progress reversed. It is that complexity could not be sustained. In some cases, complexity returns. In others, it does not. The factors are local and contingent. One of the most misleading assumptions we make is that collapse must be visible, that there must be a clear boundary where civilization ends. In reality, collapse is often gradual. Systems fail at different rates. Life continues. Adaptation masks loss. From within, it does not feel like disappearance. It feels like change. From outside, looking back across thousands of years, that change compresses into silence. This silence is what we mistake for absence. So how much of civilization can truly disappear? All of it, except what is immediately useful under new conditions. That does not mean nothing remains. It means what remains does not announce what was lost. This understanding changes how we interpret the past. It suggests that the lack of evidence is not neutral. It is shaped by survival bias. We see what endured, not what mattered most. It also changes how we think about the present. If most of civilization can disappear without leaving a clear trace, then preservation is not automatic. Memory is not guaranteed. Progress is not self-sustaining. The question becomes less about whether disappearance is possible and more about what, if anything, resists it. Some knowledge travels well through disruption. Observational skills, environmental awareness, stories that encode behaviour, others do not. It is not a question that arrives loudly. It does not announce itself with urgency or demand an immediate answer. Instead, it drifts in slowly once the earlier pieces are allowed to settle. If others rose before us and eventually fell, not as a single dramatic failure but as a gradual unravelling, then it becomes difficult to avoid turning the question inward, not as a prediction and not as a warning carved in stone, but as a quiet consideration. If others fell, could we follow? The instinctive response is often denial, or at least distance. We are different, we tell ourselves, more advanced, better informed, more connected. We understand risks earlier. We have science, data, technology, global communication. These things are real advantages. They matter, but they are also deeply entangled with the very systems that make modern civilization fragile. What makes this question uncomfortable is not the idea of collapse itself. Humans are familiar with failure. What unsettles us is the possibility that collapse does not require ignorance, cruelty, or incompetence. It can occur even when people are intelligent, cooperative, and trying their best to adapt. History shows that civilizations do not usually fall because no one saw problems coming. They fall because the problems were harder to solve than anticipated, or because solving one created pressure elsewhere. They fall because systems optimize for efficiency struggle when conditions change faster than adaptation allows. Our civilization is extraordinarily efficient. Energy moves quickly. Information travels instantly. Goods arrive just in time. This efficiency creates abundance, but it also reduces buffers. There is little slack, little redundancy. Many systems assume continuous operation and stable conditions. When those assumptions hold, everything feels solid. When they fail, fragility is revealed rapidly. The idea that we could follow others into collapse does not mean repeating their mistakes. It means encountering our own constraints. Earlier civilizations faced limits shaped by their environments, technologies, and social structures. Ours are different, but limits still exist. Environmental strain is one of the most obvious. Modern civilization relies on predictable climate patterns, stable ecosystems, and extractable resources. These are not guaranteed indefinitely. Changes in temperature, precipitation, and ocean behaviour are already altering agricultural zones, water availability, and habitability. Adaptation is possible. Humans are good at it. But adaptation takes time, coordination, and resources. It also requires foresight and collective action, which are difficult to sustain at scale, especially when impacts are unevenly distributed. Earlier societies often collapsed not because everyone suffered equally, but because stress was uneven. Some regions failed while others held. Migration increased. Tension rose. Political systems strained. Over time, cohesion fractured. We see similar patterns emerging today. Some regions adapt more easily than others. Some populations are buffered. Others are exposed. This unevenness complicates response. It creates competing priorities and narratives. Technological dependence adds another layer. Our tools are powerful, but they are interconnected. Electricity underpins communication, healthcare, transportation, food distribution. Disrupt power, and many systems falter simultaneously. This tight coupling increases vulnerability. A failure in one domain propagates quickly into others. Earlier civilizations had fewer dependencies, but also fewer tools to respond. We have more tools, but we rely on them absolutely. There is also the question of knowledge continuity. We assume that because information is abundant, it is secure. But abundance is not the same as durability. Much of our knowledge exists in digital form, dependent on infrastructure that must be actively maintained. Without power, servers go dark. Without maintenance, hardware fails. Without updates, formats become unreadable. Information does not slowly decay. It disappears abruptly. Earlier civilizations lost knowledge through the death of specialists or the destruction of institutions. We risk losing knowledge through system failure. The mechanism differs. The outcome is similar. Social cohesion is another fragile element. Large-scale societies require trust in institutions, shared narratives, and a sense of collective responsibility. When these weaken, coordination becomes difficult. Fragmentation increases. Fragmentation does not look like collapse at first. It looks like polarization, disagreement, competing interpretations of reality. These are not new phenomena, but their scale and speed are amplified by modern communication. Information travels faster than context. Signals outrun understanding. This accelerates reaction, but not necessarily reflection. Earlier civilizations experienced similar dynamics in slower forms. Factionalism, loss of legitimacy, erosion of shared norms. Over time, governance weakened, systems simplified. Modern civilization is not immune to these processes. It experiences them differently, but the underlying dynamics are familiar. One of the most persistent myths about collapse is that it is sudden and total. In reality, collapse is often uneven and prolonged. Some areas decline while others flourish. Some systems persist while others fail. Life continues. From within, it does not feel like the end. It feels like adjustment. People adapt to smaller horizons. Expectations shrink. Complexity becomes optional. This is why collapse is hard to recognize while it is happening. It does not announce itself. It normalizes. If others fell before us, they likely didn't experience it as a single moment of failure. They experienced it as a series of choices made under pressure, each reasonable in isolation, collectively transformative. This is perhaps the most unsettling part. Collapse does not require bad intentions. It emerges from constrained decision-making within complex systems. We often imagine that our awareness protects us. that because we understand these risks, we can avoid them. Awareness helps, but it is not sufficient on its own. Action requires alignment, and alignment is difficult when costs and benefits are distributed unevenly across time and population. Earlier civilizations also had awareness. They noticed environmental change, they adapted farming practices, they built defences, they restructured societies. These efforts sometimes delayed collapse. Rarely did they prevent it entirely. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means it is possible, and possibility alone is enough to warrant attention. The question of whether we could follow others into decline is not about predicting doom. It is about recognizing that our civilization operates within the same physical and social constraints as any other. We have more tools, but also more complexity. Complexity amplifies both capability and fragility. There is also the issue of scale. Modern civilization is global. Earlier civilizations were regional. When a regional civilization collapsed, others elsewhere could continue independently. Today, disruptions propagate globally. Interdependence means that local failures can have far-reaching consequences. This global integration is unprecedented. It creates efficiencies and shared knowledge, but it also reduces isolation. There are fewer safe distances. If others fell in isolation, we face the possibility of shared vulnerability. Another factor is time perception. Modern societies are oriented towards short-term cycles, economic quarters, election terms, news cycles. Long-term planning struggles to compete with immediate pressures. Earlier societies often planned across generations because survival demanded it. Ironically, our technological buffer can reduce urgency until problems become acute. This mismatch between problem timescales and decision timescales is a recurring feature of collapse narratives. Systems fail not because solutions are unknown, but because implementation lags reality. The possibility that we could follow others is not a condemnation. It is a reminder that civilization is not a possession. It is a process that must be continuously sustained. That process includes maintaining environmental balance, preserving knowledge, fostering social cohesion, and building resilience rather than just efficiency. Resilience looks unremarkable when conditions are stable. It becomes visible only under stress. Earlier civilizations often optimized for stability in their own contexts. When context shifted beyond tolerance, resilience was insufficient. The lesson is not that resilience failed, but that it has limits. Modern civilization has expanded those limits in some ways. Medicine extends life. Technology mitigates scarcity. Communication coordinates response. These are real strengths. But they also create new dependencies, new failure modes, new forms of fragility. If others fell, could we follow? The honest answer is that it is possible, not inevitable, not imminent, but possible. And possibility is enough to justify humility. Humility does not mean resignation. It means recognizing that success does not exempt us from the rules of complex systems. It means treating continuity as something that requires effort. It also means learning from silence, from gaps, from the absence of lasting traces. Those absences are not accusations, they are reminders. If earlier civilizations existed and vanished, they are not cautionary tales in the moral sense. They are case studies in constraint. They tell us that intelligence is not immunity, that progress is not linear, that memory is fragile. Following them is not a fate, it is a risk. And risks can be managed, mitigated, sometimes avoided, but only if they are acknowledged. This is why the question matters even if the premise remains uncertain. Even if there were no prior civilizations, the dynamics remain. The Earth resets systems. Complexity strains continuity. Memory erodes. The value of asking whether we could follow lies not in fear, but in focus. It shifts attention toward what actually sustains civilization over long spans. Not innovation alone, but maintenance. Not growth alone, but balance. There is something quietly grounding about realizing that this moment, whatever else it may be, is not happening in isolation. To be here this time is not just to exist at a particular point on a timeline, but to occupy a position within a much longer sequence of attempts, adjustments, successes, and losses. Whether or not there were civilizations before ours that rose and vanished completely, we are undeniably living inside a fragile arrangement that depends on conditions we did not create and do not fully control. Being here now means inheriting a world already shaped by deep processes, landscapes formed long before us, climates that oscillate on scales larger than a human lifetime, biological systems that evolved without regard for our plans. Civilization sits on top of all of that, not above it. We often speak as though we have transcended nature, but our dependence on it remains total. Food, water, energy, materials, even stability itself come from systems that operate on their own terms. What distinguishes this moment from earlier ones is not that we are exempt from those constraints, but that we are unusually aware of them. We can measure atmospheric change, we can model ecological feedbacks, we can trace supply chains and simulate risk. This awareness is new. It does not guarantee good outcomes, but it changes the nature of responsibility. Earlier societies responded to change largely through experience. They adapted after disruption occurred, sometimes quickly, sometimes too late. Their understanding of planetary systems was practical rather than abstract. They knew seasons, soils, animals, and weather intimately, but not globally. They could not see the whole. We can, at least partially. That does not make our position easier. In some ways, it makes it heavier. Awareness without coordination creates tension. Knowing what is happening does not automatically translate into the ability to act collectively. Large systems move slowly, even when signals are clear. So what does it mean to be here this time, with this level of knowledge and this degree of fragility? It means living in a moment where continuity is possible, but not guaranteed, where collapse is conceivable, but not inevitable, where choices matter, not because they can control everything, but because they influence trajectories. One of the most important shifts that comes with this perspective is how success is defined. Modern civilization often equates success with expansion, more production, faster movement, greater extraction, larger systems. This framing made sense during periods when resources felt abundant and consequences seemed distant. But deep time tells a different story. Expansion without restraint has limits. Systems optimized only for growth become brittle. They perform exceptionally well until they fail, and then they fail quickly. Being here now invites a different definition of success, one that values durability over speed, redundancy over efficiency, maintenance over novelty. These are not glamorous qualities, they do not dominate headlines, but they are what allow systems to persist. Earlier civilizations that lasted longer often did so by balancing ambition with restraint. Not perfectly, and not forever, but intentionally. They managed landscapes carefully. They embedded knowledge in tradition. They accepted limits. When those balances failed, collapse followed. Modern civilization has pushed limits further than any before it, not necessarily because it is wiser, but because it has access to concentrated energy and global coordination. Fossil fuels, in particular, change the scale of what is possible. They compressed time. They allowed work that would have taken centuries to be done in decades. That acceleration is extraordinary. It is also temporary. Being here this time means living during the tail end of an energy transition that no civilization before us experienced. We are managing abundance and its consequences simultaneously. That is historically unusual. It also means that we are surrounded by layers of abstraction. Most people do not see how their food is produced, how their water is cleaned, how their energy is generated. These systems are hidden by design because visibility is not required for daily function. But invisibility creates distance. Distance weakens care. Earlier societies were forced to remain close to the systems that sustained them. Failure was immediate and personal. That proximity fostered respect, even if it did not prevent collapse. We are buffered. That buffer is both a gift and a risk. It allows time for adaptation, but it also delays response. To be here now is to live inside that delay. Another defining feature of this moment is scale. No earlier civilization affected the planet as a whole in measurable ways. Regional impacts existed, sometimes severe, but they were localized. Today, human activity influences atmospheric chemistry, ocean circulation, and global biodiversity. This does not make us villains. It makes us participants in a system that grew faster than its feedback mechanisms. Being here this time means reckoning with unintended consequences, not as moral failings, but as structural realities. Systems optimized for one set of conditions inevitably struggle when those conditions change. The question becomes whether adjustment can happen deliberately rather than through collapse. Earlier civilizations rarely had that option. Their feedback loops were slower or less visible. By the time effects were undeniable, choices were limited. We have earlier signals. The challenge is translating them into action without waiting for crisis to force simplification. What it means to be here is also deeply personal. Civilization is not just infrastructure and institutions, it is daily life, habits, expectations, the stories we tell ourselves about normalcy. Normal is a moving target. What feels stable now would have felt impossible a few centuries ago. What feels essential today may feel unnecessary tomorrow. Recognizing this fluidity can be unsettling. It can also be freeing. If civilizations are cycles rather than monuments, then the goal shifts. Instead of trying to freeze a particular configuration indefinitely, the focus becomes guiding transitions with care, minimizing harm, preserving what matters most. What matters most is not every technology or convenience. It is the capacity to learn, to cooperate, to pass on knowledge in forms that survive disruption. This is where deep time thinking becomes practical rather than abstract. It encourages us to ask which aspects of our civilization are resilient and which are brittle, which can adapt under stress and which require perfect conditions. Digital knowledge is powerful but fragile. Oral and experiential knowledge is limited but durable. Written record sits somewhere in between. No single form is sufficient. Resilience comes from diversity. Earlier civilizations relied heavily on embodied knowledge. Skills learned through doing. Observations passed through practice. This made them adaptable locally but vulnerable to large-scale disruption. Modern civilization relies heavily on externalized knowledge, databases, networks, archives. This allows immense complexity but creates dependence on infrastructure. Being here this time means recognizing the strengths and weaknesses of both and finding ways to bridge them. Education plays a role here. Not just formal education, but cultural education. Teaching not only how to use systems, but how they work. Teaching not only specialized skills, but contextual understanding. A society where knowledge is widely distributed is more resilient than one where expertise is concentrated. This is true at any scale. Community matters for the same reason. Large systems fail gracefully only when smaller systems can operate independently. Local food systems, local energy, local governance. These are not regressions, they are buffers. Earlier civilizations often fell back on local structures when centralized ones failed. Those that lacked them struggled more. Being here now means having the opportunity to design buffers deliberately, rather than discovering the need for them under duress. It also means confronting narratives of inevitability. Both optimistic and pessimistic versions can be paralyzing. The belief that everything will work out automatically encourages inaction. The belief that collapse is unavoidable encourages resignation. Neither is supported by history. History shows variability. Some collapses were total, others were partial, some were followed by recovery, others were not. Outcomes depended on timing, choices, environment, and chance. We are not passengers on a predetermined track. We are participants in an evolving system. That participation is uneven. Power, responsibility, and impact are not distributed equally. This complicates collective action. But complexity does not absolve responsibility. It reframes it. Being here this time also means living with uncertainty, not knowing how transitions will unfold, not knowing which systems will adapt and which will fail. This uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it is honest. Earlier societies lived with uncertainty constantly. Weather, harvests, health. Their uncertainty was immediate. Ours is distributed across scales and models. Both require humility. Humility does not mean minimizing achievements. It means recognizing limits. It means accepting that intelligence does not grant control, only influence. One of the most valuable shifts that comes from considering prior cycles is a reduction in arrogance. Not in ambition, but in certainty. The belief that we are uniquely immune to forces that shaped everything before us is a dangerous one. Being here now invites a quieter confidence, one grounded in adaptability rather than dominance. It also invites attention to legacy. Not legacy as fame or monuments, but as continuity. What knowledge will survive disruption? What practices will persist when convenience disappears? What values endure when conditions change? These questions are rarely asked at the scale of civilization because answers are not simple, but they can be asked locally, within families, communities, institutions. Small-scale resilience scales upward more reliably than large-scale control. Earlier civilizations that lasted longer often did so not because they avoided disruption, but because they could absorb it. They bent without breaking completely. They reconfigured. We do not need to romanticize the past to learn from this. We only need to notice patterns. To be here this time is to live at a moment where those patterns are visible if we choose to look. Where the silence of erased histories is not just an absence, but a context. That silence does not accuse. It informs. It tells us that complexity is precious and fragile. That memory requires care. That systems last longer when they are designed to change. It also tells us that being the current cycle, whether first or seventh, carries no inherent guarantee of permanence. What it carries is opportunity. Opportunity to steer rather than drift, to preserve rather than assume, to choose maintenance over neglect. None of this requires believing in lost advanced civilizations. It only requires taking seriously what we already know about how systems behave over time. In that sense, the question of how many came before us becomes less important than how we inhabit the present. Whether we act as though continuity is automatic, or as though it must be earned repeatedly. Being here this time means holding both confidence and caution. Confidence in our capacity to learn and adapt. Caution in assuming that capacity will always express itself in time. It means recognizing that the future will judge us not by what we intended, but by what endured. And endurance rarely belongs to the loudest or fastest achievements. It belongs to the quiet structures that keep functioning when attention moves elsewhere. As this thought settles, there is no need to draw conclusions or offer prescriptions. This is not an ending. It is a position, a place to stand while looking both backward and forward. Whatever came before us and whatever comes after, this moment is ours to inhabit. And how we inhabit it shapes the conditions for whatever follows, even if those conditions are never recorded in ways we expect, or remembered in ways we can recognize.